Where Good Idea Come From, by Stephen Johnson. Audiobooks from 27audiobooks.com. Part 1. This part include 4 chapters. Chapter 1, The Adjacent Possible. Chapter 2, Liquid Networks. Chapter 3, The Slow Hunch. Chapter 4, Serendipity. Chapter 1. The Adjacent Possible. Sometime in the late 1870s, a Parisian obstetrician named Stéphane Tarnier took a day off from his work at Maternité de Paris, the lying-in hospital for the city's poor women, and paid a visit to the nearby Paris Zoo. Wandering past the elephants and reptiles and classical gardens of the zoo's home inside the Jardin des Plantes, Tarnier stumbled across an exhibit of chicken incubators. Seeing the hatchlings totter about in the incubator's warm enclosure triggered an association in his head, and before long he had hired Odile Martin, the zoo's poultry raiser, to construct a device that would perform a similar function for human newborns. By modern standards, infant mortality was staggeringly high in the late 19th century, even in a city as sophisticated as Paris. 1 in 5 babies died before learning to crawl, and the odds were far worse for premature babies born with low birth weights. Tarnier knew that temperature regulation was critical for keeping these infants alive, and he knew that the French medical establishment had a deep-seated obsession with statistics. And so as soon as his newborn incubator had been installed at Maternité, the fragile infants warmed by hot water bottles below the wooden boxes, Tarnier embarked on a quick study of 500 babies. The results shocked the Parisian medical establishment. While 66% of low-weight babies died within weeks of birth, only 38% died if they were housed in Tarnier's incubating box. You could effectively halve the mortality rate for premature babies simply by treating them like hatchlings in a zoo. Tarnier's incubator was not the first device employed for warming newborns, and the contraption he built with Martin would be improved upon significantly in the subsequent decades. But Tarnier's statistical analysis gave newborn incubation the push that it needed. Within a few years, the Paris Municipal Board required that incubators be installed in all the city's maternity hospitals. In 1896, an enterprising physician named Alexander Lyon set up a display of incubators with live newborns at the Berlin Exposition. Dubbed the Kinderbrutenstall, or Child Hatchery, Lyon's exhibit turned out to be the sleeper hit of the exposition and launched a bizarre tradition of incubator sideshows that persisted well into the 20th century. Modern incubators, supplemented with high-oxygen therapy and other advances, became standard equipment in all American hospitals after the end of World War II, triggering a spectacular 75% decline in infant mortality rates between 1950 and 1998. Because incubators focus exclusively on the beginning of life, their benefit to public health, measured by the sheer number of extra years they provide, rivals any medical advance of the 20th century. Radiation therapy or a double bypass might give you another decade or two, but an incubator gives you an entire lifetime. In the developing world, however, the infant mortality story remains bleak. Whereas infant deaths are below 10 per thousand births throughout Europe and the United States, over 100 infants die per thousand in countries like Liberia and Ethiopia, many of them premature babies that would have survived with access to incubators. But modern incubators are complex, expensive things. A standard incubator in an American hospital might cost more than $40,000, but the expense is arguably the smaller hurdle to overcome. Complex equipment breaks, and when it breaks you need the technical expertise to fix it, and you need replacement parts. In the year that followed the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the Indonesian city of Mulabo received 8 incubators from a range of international relief organizations. By late 2008, when an MIT professor named Timothy Prestero visited the hospital, all 8 were out of order, the victims of power surges and tropical humidity, along with the hospital staff's inability to read the English repair manual. The Mulabo incubators were a representative sample. Some studies suggest that as much as 95% of medical technology donated to developing countries breaks within the first 5 years of use. Prestero had a vested interest in those broken incubators because the organization he founded, Design That Matters, had been working for several years on a new scheme for a more reliable and less expensive incubator. One that recognized complex medical technology was likely to have a very different tenure in a developing world context than it would in an American or European hospital. Designing an incubator for a developing country wasn't just a matter of creating something that worked. It was also a matter of designing something that would break in a non-catastrophic way. You couldn't guarantee a steady supply of spare parts or trained repair technicians, so instead, Prestero and his team decided to build an incubator out of parts that were already abundant in the developing world. The idea had originated with a Boston doctor named Jonathan Rosen, who had observed that even the smaller towns of the developing world seemed to be able to keep automobiles in working order. The towns might have lacked air conditioning and laptops and cable television, but they managed to keep their Toyota 4Runners on the road. So Rosen approached Prestero with an idea. What if you made an incubator out of automobile parts? 3 years after Rosen suggested the idea, the Design That Matters team introduced a prototype device called the Neo-Nurture. From the outside, it looked like a streamlined modern incubator, but its guts were automotive. Sealed beam headlights supplied the crucial warmth, dashboard fans provided filtered air circulation, door chimes sounded alarms. You could power the device via an adapted cigarette lighter or a standard-issue motorcycle battery. Building the Neo-Nurture out of car parts was doubly efficient, because it tapped both the local supply of parts themselves and the local knowledge of automobile repair. These were both abundant resources in the developing world context, as Rosen liked to say. You didn't have to be a trained medical technician to fix the Neo-Nurture, you didn't even have to read the manual. You just needed to know how to replace a broken headlight. Good ideas are like the Neo-Nurture device. They are, inevitably, constrained by the parts and skills that surround them. We have a natural tendency to romanticize breakthrough innovations, imagining momentous ideas transcending their surroundings, a gifted mind somehow seeing over the detritus of old ideas and ossified tradition. But ideas are works of bricolage, they're built out of that detritus. We take the ideas we've inherited or that we've stumbled across, and we jigger them together into some new shape. We like to think of our ideas as $40,000 incubators, shipped direct from the factory, but in reality they've been cobbled together with spare parts that happen to be sitting in the garage. Before his untimely death in 2002, the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould maintained an odd collection of footwear that he had purchased during his travels through the developing world, in open-air markets in Quito, Nairobi, and Delhi. They were sandals made from recycled automobile tires. As a fashion statement, they may not have amounted to much, but Gould treasured his tire sandals as a testimony to human ingenuity. But he also saw them as a metaphor for the patterns of innovation in the biological world. Nature's innovations, too, rely on spare parts. Evolution advances by taking available resources and cobbling them together to create new uses. The evolutionary theorist Francois Jacob captured this in his concept of evolution as a tinker, not an engineer. Our bodies are also works of bricolage, old parts strung together to form something radically new. The tires to sandals principle works at all scales and times, Gould wrote, permitting odd and unpredictable initiatives at any moment, to make nature as inventive as the cleverest person who ever pondered the potential of a junkyard in Nairobi. You can see this process at work in the primordial innovation of life itself. We do not yet have scientific consensus on the specifics of life's origins. Some believe life originated in the boiling, metallic vents of undersea volcanoes. Others suspect the open oceans. Others point to the tidal ponds where Darwin believed life first took hold. Many respected scientists think that life may have arrived from outer space, embedded in a meteor. But we have a much clearer picture of the composition of Earth's atmosphere before life emerged, thanks to a field known as prebiotic chemistry. The lifeless Earth was dominated by a handful of basic molecules: ammonia, methane, water, carbon dioxide, a smattering of amino acids, and other simple organic compounds. Each of these molecules was capable of a finite series of transformations and exchanges with other molecules in the primordial soup, methane and oxygen recombining to form formaldehyde and water, for instance. Think of all those initial molecules, and then imagine all the potential new combinations that they could form spontaneously, simply by colliding with each other. If you could play God and trigger all those combinations, you would end up with most of the building blocks of life, the proteins that form the boundaries of cells, sugar molecules crucial to the nucleic acids of our DNA. But you would not be able to trigger chemical reactions that would build a mosquito, or a sunflower, or a human brain. Formaldehyde is a first-order combination. You can create it directly from the molecules in the primordial soup. The atomic elements that make up a sunflower are the very same ones available on Earth before the emergence of life. But you can't spontaneously create a sunflower in that environment, because it relies on a whole series of subsequent innovations that wouldn't evolve on Earth for billions of years. Chloroplasts to capture the sun's energy, vascular tissues to circulate resources through the plant, DNA molecules to pass on sunflower building instructions to the next generation. The scientist Stuart Kauffman has a suggestive name for the set of all those first-order combinations: the adjacent possible. The phrase captures both the limits and the creative potential of change and innovation. In the case of prebiotic chemistry, The adjacent possible defines all those molecular reactions that were directly achievable in the primordial soup. Sunflowers and mosquitoes and brains exist outside that circle of possibility. The adjacent possible is a kind of shadow future, hovering on the edges of the present state of things, a map of all the ways in which the present can reinvent itself. Yet is it not an infinite space, or a totally open playing field? The number of potential first-order reactions is vast, but it is a finite number, and it excludes most of the forms that now populate the biosphere. What the adjacent possible tells us is that at any moment the world is capable of extraordinary change, but only certain changes can happen. The strange and beautiful truth about the adjacent possible is that its boundaries grow as you explore those boundaries. Each new combination ushers new combinations into the adjacent possible. Think of it as a house that magically expands with each door you open. You begin in a room with 4 doors, each leading to a new room that you haven't visited yet. Those 4 rooms are the adjacent possible. But once you open one of those doors and stroll into that room, 3 new doors appear, each leading to a brand new room that you couldn't have reached from your original starting point. Keep opening new doors and eventually you'll have built a palace. Basic fatty acids will naturally self-organize into spheres lined with a dual layer of molecules, very similar to the membranes that define the boundaries of modern cells. Once the fatty acids combine to form those bounded spheres, a new wing of the adjacent possible opens up, because those molecules implicitly create a fundamental division between the inside and outside of the sphere. This division is the very essence of a cell. Once you have an inside, you can put things there: food, organelles, genetic code. Small molecules can pass through the membrane and then combine with other molecules to form larger entities too big to escape back through the boundaries of the protocell. When the first fatty acids spontaneously formed those dual-layered membranes, they opened a door into the adjacent possible that would ultimately lead to nucleotide-based genetic code and the power plants of the chloroplasts and mitochondria, the primary inhabitants of all modern cells. The same pattern appears again and again throughout the evolution of life. Indeed, one way to think about the path of evolution is as a continual exploration of the adjacent possible. When dinosaurs such as the velociraptor evolved a new bone called the semilunate carpal, it enabled them to swivel their wrists with far more flexibility. In the short term, this gave them more dexterity as predators, but it also opened a door in the adjacent possible that would eventually lead, many millions of years later, to the evolution of wings and flight. When our ancestors evolved opposable thumbs, they opened up a whole new cultural branch of the adjacent possible, the creation and use of finely crafted tools and weapons. One of the things that I find so inspiring in Kaufman's notion of the adjacent possible is the continuum it suggests between natural and man-made systems. He introduced the concept in part to illustrate a fascinating secular trend shared by both natural and human history, this relentless pushing back against the barricades of the adjacent possible. Something has obviously happened in the past 4.8 billion years, he writes. The biosphere has expanded, indeed, more or less persistently exploded, into the ever-expanding adjacent possible. It is more than slightly interesting that this fact is clearly true, that it is rarely remarked upon, and that we have no particular theory for this expansion. 4 billion years ago, if you were a carbon atom, there were a few hundred molecular configurations you could stumble into. Today that same carbon atom, whose atomic properties haven't changed one single nanogram, can help build a sperm whale, or a giant redwood or an H1N1 virus, along with a near-infinite list of other carbon-based life forms that were not part of the adjacent possible of prebiotic Earth. Add to that an equally formidable list of human concoctions that rely on carbon, every single object on the planet made of plastic, for instance, and you can see how far the kingdom of the adjacent possible has expanded since those fatty acids self-assembled into the first membrane. The history of life and human culture, then, can be told as the story of a gradual but relentless probing of the adjacent possible, each new innovation opening up new paths to explore. But some systems are more adept than others at exploring those possibility spaces. The mystery of Darwin's paradox that we began with ultimately revolves around the question of why a coral reef ecosystem should be so adventurous in its exploration of the adjacent possible, so many different life forms sharing such a small space, while the surrounding waters of the ocean lack that same marvelous diversity. Similarly, the environments of big cities allow far more commercial exploration of the adjacent possible than towns or villages, allowing tradesmen and entrepreneurs to specialize in fields that would be unsustainable in smaller population centers. The web has explored the adjacent possible of its medium far faster than any other communications technology in history. In early 1994, the web was a text-only medium, pages of words connected by hyperlinks. But within a few years, the possibility space began to expand. It became a medium that let you do financial transactions, which turned it into a shopping mall and an auction house and a casino. Shortly afterward, it became a true two-way medium where it was as easy to publish your own writing as it was to read other people's, which engendered forms that the world had never seen before: user-authored encyclopedias, the blogosphere, social network sites. YouTube made the web one of the most influential video delivery mechanisms on the planet. And now digital maps are unleashing their own cartographic revolutions. You can see the fingerprints of the adjacent possible in one of the most remarkable patterns in all of intellectual history. What scholars now call the multiple. A brilliant idea occurs to a scientist or inventor somewhere in the world, and he goes public with his remarkable finding, only to discover that 3 other minds had independently come up with the same idea in the past year. Sunspots were simultaneously discovered in 1611 by 4 scientists living in 4 different countries. The first electrical battery was invented separately by Dean von Kleist and Cunius of Leyden in 1745 and 1746. Joseph Priestley and Carl Wilhelm Scheele independently isolated oxygen between 1772 and 1774. The law of the conservation of energy was formulated separately 4 times in the late 1840s. The evolutionary importance of genetic mutation was proposed by S. Korskinski in 1899 and then by Hugo de Vries in 1901, while the impact of X-rays on mutation rates was independently uncovered by 2 scholars in 1927. The telephone, telegraph, steam engine, photograph, vacuum tube, radio, just about every essential technological advance of modern life has a multiple lurking somewhere in its origin story. In the early 1920s, 2 Columbia University scholars named William Ogburn and Dorothy Thomas decided to track down as many multiples as they could find, eventually publishing their survey in an influential essay with the delightful title, "Are Inventions Inevitable?" Ogburn and Thomas found 148 instances of independent innovation, most of them occurring within the same decade. Reading the list now, one is struck not just by the sheer number of cases, but how indistinguishable the list is from an unfiltered history of big ideas. Multiples have been invoked to support hazy theories about the zeitgeist, but they have a much more grounded explanation. Good ideas are not conjured out of thin air. They are built out of a collection of existing parts, the composition of which expands over time. Some of those parts are conceptual, ways of solving problems, or new definitions of what constitutes a problem in the first place. Some of them are, literally, mechanical parts. To go looking for oxygen, Priestley and Scheele needed the conceptual framework that the air was itself something worth studying, and that it was made up of distinct gases. Neither of these ideas became widely accepted until the second half of the 18th century. But they also needed the advanced scales that enabled them to measure the minuscule changes in weight triggered by oxidation, technology that was itself only a few decades old in 1774. When those parts became available, the discovery of oxygen entered the realm of the adjacent possible. Isolating oxygen was, as the saying goes, in the air, but only because a specific set of prior discoveries and inventions had made that experiment thinkable. The adjacent possible is as much about limits as it is about openings. At every moment in the timeline of an expanding biosphere, there are doors that cannot be unlocked yet. In human culture, we like to think of breakthrough ideas as sudden accelerations on the timeline, where a genius jumps ahead 50 years and invents something that normal minds, trapped in the present moment, couldn't possibly have come up with. But the truth is that technological advances rarely break out of the adjacent possible. The history of cultural progress is, almost without exception, a story of one door leading to another door, exploring the palace one room at a time. But of course, human minds are not bound by the finite laws of molecule formation, and so every now and then an idea does occur to someone that teleports us forward a few rooms, skipping some exploratory steps in the adjacent possible. But those ideas almost always end up being short-term failures, precisely because they have skipped ahead. We have a phrase for those ideas. We call them ahead of their time. Consider the legendary analytical engine designed by 19th-century British inventor Charles Babbage, who is considered by most technology historians to be the father of modern computing, though he should probably be called the great-grandfather of modern computing, because it took several generations for the world to catch up to his idea. Babbage is actually in the pantheon for 2 inventions, neither of which he managed to build during his lifetime. The first was his difference engine, a fantastically complex 15-ton contraption with over 25,000 mechanical parts, designed to calculate polynomial functions that were essential to creating the trigonometric tables crucial to navigation. Had Babbage actually completed his project, the difference engine would have been the world's most advanced mechanical calculator. When the London Science Museum constructed one from Babbage's plans to commemorate the centennial of his death, the machine returned accurate results to 31 places in a matter of seconds. Both the speed and precision of the device would have exceeded anything else possible in Babbage's time by several orders of magnitude. For all its complexity, however, the difference engine was well within the adjacent possible of Victorian technology. The second half of the 19th century saw a steady stream of improvements to mechanical calculation, many of them building on Babbage's architecture. The Swiss inventor Per George Schütz constructed a working difference engine that debuted at the Exposition Universelle of 1855. Within 2 decades, the piano-sized Schütz design had been reduced to the size of a sewing machine. In 1884, an American inventor named William S. Burroughs founded the American Arithmometer Company to sell mass-produced calculators to businesses around the country. Babbage's design for the difference engine was a work of genius, no doubt, but it did not transcend the adjacent possible of its day. The same cannot be said of Babbage's other brilliant idea, the analytical engine, the great unfulfilled project of Babbage's career, which he toiled on for the last 30 years of his life. The machine was so complicated that it never got past the blueprint stage, save a small portion that Babbage built shortly before his death in 1871. The analytical engine was, on paper at least, the world's first programmable computer. Being programmable meant that the machine was fundamentally open-ended. It wasn't designed for a specific set of tasks, the way the difference engine had been optimized for polynomial equations. The analytical engine was, like all modern computers, a shape-shifter capable of reinventing itself based on the instructions conjured by its programmers. Babbage's design for the engine anticipated the basic structure of all contemporary computers. Programs were to be inputted via punch cards, which had been invented decades before to control textile looms. Instructions and data were captured in a store, the equivalent of what we now call random access memory, or RAM, and calculations were executed via a system that Babbage called the mill, using industrial-era language to describe what we now call the Central Processing Unit, or CPU. Babbage had most of this system sketched out by 1837, but the first true computer to use this programmable architecture didn't appear for more than 100 years. While the difference engine engendered an immediate series of refinements and practical applications, the analytical engine effectively disappeared from the map. Many of the pioneering insights that Babbage had hit upon in the 1830s had to be independently rediscovered by the visionaries of World War II-era computer science. Why did the analytical engine prove to be such a short-term dead end? Given the brilliance of Babbage's ideas, the fancy way to say it is that his ideas had escaped the bounds of the adjacent possible. But it is perhaps better put in more prosaic terms. Babbage simply didn't have the right spare parts. Even if Babbage had built a machine to his specs, it is unclear whether it would have worked, because Babbage was effectively sketching out a machine for the electronic age during the middle of the steam-powered mechanical revolution. Unlike all modern computers, Babbage's machine was to be composed entirely of mechanical gears and switches, staggering in their number and in the intricacy of their design. Information flowed through the system as a constant ballet of metal objects shifting positions in carefully choreographed movement. It was a maintenance nightmare, but more than that, it was bound to be hopelessly slow. Babbage bragged to Ada Lovelace that he believed the machine would be able to multiply two 20-digit numbers in 3 minutes. Even if he was right, Babbage wouldn't have been the first tech entrepreneur to exaggerate his product's performance. That kind of processing time would have made executing more complicated programs tortuously slow. The first computers of the digital age could perform the same calculation in a matter of seconds. An iPhone completes millions of such calculations in the same amount of time. Programmable computers needed vacuum tubes, or, even better, integrated circuits, where information flows as tiny pulses of electrical activity instead of clanking, rusting, steam-powered metal gears. You can see a comparable pattern on a vastly accelerated timetable in the story of YouTube. Had Hurley, Chen, and Karan tried to execute the exact same idea for YouTube 10 years earlier, in 1995, it would have been a spectacular flop because a site for sharing video was not within the adjacent possible of the early web. For starters, the vast majority of web users were on painfully slow dial-up connections that could sometimes take minutes to download a small image. Another key to YouTube's early success is that its developers were able to base the video serving on Adobe's Flash platform, which meant that they could focus on the ease of sharing and discussing clips, and not spend millions of dollars developing a whole new video standard from scratch. But Flash itself wasn't released until late 1996, and didn't even support video until 2002. To use our microbiology analogy, having the idea for a difference engine in the 1830s was like a bunch of fatty acids trying to form a cell membrane. Babbage's calculating machine was a leap forward, to be sure, but as advanced as it was, the difference engine was still within the bounds of the adjacent possible, which is precisely why so many practical iterations of Babbage's design emerged in the subsequent decades. But trying to create an analytical engine in 1850, or YouTube in 1995, was the equivalent of those fatty acids trying to self-organize into a sea urchin. The idea was right, but the environment wasn't ready for it yet. All of us live inside our own private versions of the adjacent possible, in our work lives, in our creative pursuits, in the organizations that employ us, in the communities we inhabit. In all these different environments, we are surrounded by potential new configurations, new ways of breaking out of our standard routines. We are, each of us, surrounded by the conceptual equivalent of those Toyota spare parts, all waiting to be recombined into something magical, something new. It need not be the epic advances of biological diversity or the invention of programmable computing. Unlocking a new door can lead to a world-changing scientific breakthrough, but it can also lead to a more effective strategy for teaching second graders or a novel marketing idea for the vacuum cleaner your company's about to release. The trick is to figure out ways to explore the edges of possibility that surround you. This can be as simple as changing the physical environment you work in, or cultivating a specific kind of social network, or maintaining certain habits in the way you seek out and store information. Recall the question we began with: what kind of environment creates good ideas? The simplest way to answer it is this: innovative environments are better at helping their inhabitants explore the adjacent possible, because they expose a wide and diverse sample of spare parts, mechanical or conceptual, and they encourage novel ways of recombining those parts. Environments that block or limit those new combinations, by punishing experimentation, by obscuring certain branches of possibility, by making the current state so satisfying that no one bothers to explore the edges, will, on average, generate and circulate fewer innovations than environments that encourage exploration. The infinite variety of life that so impressed Darwin, standing in the calm waters of the Keeling Islands, exists because the coral reef is supremely gifted at recycling and reinventing the spare parts of its ecosystem. There's a famous moment in the story of the near-catastrophic Apollo 13 mission, wonderfully captured in the Ron Howard film, where the mission control engineers realize they need to create an improvised carbon dioxide filter, where the astronauts will poison the lunar module atmosphere with their own exhalations before they return to Earth. The astronauts have plenty of carbon scrubbers on board, but these filters were designed for the original, damaged spacecraft and don't fit the air ventilation system of the lunar module they are using as a lifeboat to return home. Mission Control quickly assembles what it calls a tiger team of engineers to hack their way through the problem, and creates a rapid-fire inventory of all the available equipment currently on the lunar module. In the movie, Deke Slayton, head of flight crew operations, tosses a jumbled pile of gear on a conference table: suit hoses, canisters, stowage bags, duct tape, and other assorted gadgets. He holds up the carbon scrubbers. "We gotta find a way to make this fit into a hole for this," he says, and then points to the spare parts on the table, using nothing but that. The space gear on the table defines the adjacent possible for the problem of building a working carbon scrubber on a lunar module. The device they eventually concoct, dubbed the mailbox, performs beautifully. The canisters and nozzles are like the ammonia and methane molecules of the early Earth, or Babbage's mechanical gears, or those Toyota parts heating an incubator. They are the building blocks that create and limit the space of possibility for a specific problem. In a way, the engineers at Mission Control had it easier than most. Challenging problems don't usually define their adjacent possible in such a clear, tangible way. Part of coming up with a good idea is discovering what those spare parts are, and ensuring that you're not just recycling the same old ingredients. This, then, is where the next 6 patterns of innovation will take us, because they all involve, in one way or another, tactics for assembling a more eclectic collection of building block ideas, spare parts that can be reassembled into useful new configurations. The trick to having good ideas is not to sit around in glorious isolation and try to think big thoughts. The trick is to get more parts on the table. Chapter 2. Liquid Networks. There are a dozen different metaphors we use colloquially to describe good ideas. We call them sparks, flashes, light bulb moments. We have brainstorms and breakthroughs, eureka moments and epiphanies. Something about the concept pushes our language into rhetorical overdrive, our verbiage straining to reproduce the innovation it describes. And yet, florid as they are, none of those metaphors captures what an idea actually is on the most elemental level. A good idea is a network. A specific constellation of neurons, thousands of them, fire in sync with each other for the first time in your brain, and an idea pops into your consciousness. A new idea is a network of cells exploring the adjacent possible of connections that they can make in your mind. This is true whether the idea in question is a new way to solve a complex physics problem, or a closing line for a novel, or a feature for a software application. If we're going to try to explain the mystery of where ideas come from, we'll have to start by shaking ourselves free of this common misconception: an idea is not a single thing. It is more like a swarm. When you think about ideas in their native state of neural networks, two key preconditions become clear. First, the sheer size of the network. You can't have an epiphany with only 3 neurons firing. The network needs to be densely populated. Your brain has roughly 100 billion neurons, an impressive enough number. But all those neurons would be useless for creating ideas if they weren't capable of making such elaborate connections with each other. The average neuron connects to 1,000 other neurons scattered across the brain, which means that the adult human brain contains 100 trillion distinct neuronal connections, making it the largest and most complex network on Earth. By comparison, there are somewhere on the order of 40 billion pages on the web. If you assume an average of 10 links per page, that means you and I are walking around with a high-density network in our skulls that is orders of magnitude larger than the entirety of the World Wide Web. The second precondition is that the network be plastic, capable of adopting new configurations. A dense network incapable of forming new patterns is, by definition, incapable of change, incapable of probing at the edges of the adjacent possible. When a new idea pops into your head, the sense of novelty that makes the experience so magical has a direct correlate in the cells of your brain. A brand new assemblage of neurons has come together to make the thought possible. Those connections are built by our genes and by personal experience. Some connections help regulate our heartbeat and trigger reflex reactions. Others conjure up vivid sense memories of the cookies we ate as children. Others help us invent the concept of a programmable computer. The connections are the key to wisdom, which is why the whole notion of losing neurons after we hit adulthood is a red herring. What matters in your mind is not just the number of neurons, but the myriad connections that have formed between them. Of course, everything that happens in your brain is, technically speaking, a network. Remembering to cut your toenails involves a network of neurons firing in some kind of orderly fashion. But that doesn't make it an epiphany. It turns out that good ideas have certain signature patterns in the networks that make them. The creating brain behaves differently from the brain that is performing a repetitive task. The neurons communicate in different ways. The networks take on distinct shapes. The question is how to push your brain toward those more creative networks. The answer, as it happens, is delightfully fractal. To make your mind more innovative, you have to place it inside environments that share that same network signature. Networks of ideas are people that mimic the neural networks of a mind exploring the boundaries of the adjacent possible. Certain environments enhance the brain's natural capacity to make new links of association. But these patterns of connection are much older than the human brain, older than neurons even. They take us back, once again, to the origin of life itself. As far as we know, carbon-based life is a redundant expression. Life would be impossible without the carbon atom. Most astrobiologists, scientists who study the possibility of life elsewhere in the universe, believe that if we are ever to discover convincing evidence of extraterrestrial life, be it on Mars or in some distant galaxy, it, too, will turn out to be carbon-based. Why are we so confident about carbon's essential role in creating living things? The answer has to do with the core properties of the carbon atom itself. Carbon has 4 valence electrons residing in the outermost shell of the atom, which, for complicated reasons, makes it uniquely talented at forming connections with other atoms, particularly with hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and, crucially, with other carbon atoms. These 6 atoms make up 99% of the dry weight of all living organisms on Earth. Those 4 valence bonds give carbon a strong propensity for forming elaborate chains and rings of polymers, everything from the genetic information stored in nucleic acids, to the building blocks of proteins, to the energy storage of carbohydrates and fats. Carbon atoms measure only 0.03% of the overall composition of the Earth's crust, and yet they make up nearly 20% of our body mass. That abundance highlights the unique property of the carbon atom, its combinatorial power. Carbon is a connector. Those connections are essential for the day-to-day functioning of life. Chains of nucleic acids instructing amino acids to assemble into long strings of protein, powered by the stored energy of carbohydrate. But the connective properties of carbon were essential to the original innovations of life itself. Without carbon's innate talent for forming new complex molecules with other atoms, it is hard to imagine how the first organisms would have evolved. Those 4 valence electrons allowed the prebiotic Earth to explore its own adjacent possible, sifting through the long list of potential molecular combinations until it hit upon a series of stable chemical reactions that blossomed into the first organisms. Without the generative links of carbon, the Earth would have likely remained a lifeless soup of elements, a planet of dead chemistry. Carbon's connective talents lie at the center of one of the most famous scientific experiments of the 20th century. In 1953, 2 University of Chicago professors, Stanley L. Miller and Harold C. Urey, created a closed system of glass tubes and flasks that simulated the early conditions of the prebiotic Earth. The main ingredients were methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water. Only the methane contained carbon atoms. One flask connected to the chemical soup contained a pair of electrodes, which Miller and Urey used to simulate lightning by triggering a series of quick sparks between them. They ran the experiment for 7 straight days, and by the time they had completed the first cycle, they found that more than 10% of the carbon had spontaneously recombined into many of the organic compounds essential to life: sugars, lipids, nucleic acids. Miller claimed at the time that just turning on the spark in a basic prebiotic experiment produced half of the 22 amino acids. Several years ago, a team reanalyzed the original flasks from the Miller-Urey experiments and found that in one version, which simulated the environment around an undersea volcano, all 22 amino acids had been created. In the half-century that has passed since Miller and Urey triggered their primordial spark, hundreds of rival theories have emerged to explain the early stages of life, some emphasizing the initial development of self-replication, some emphasizing the development of metabolism, some are predicated on the intense heat of undersea vents, others on life-bearing comets colliding with the Earth's surface. But all of these theories share a common motif: the combinatorial power of the carbon atom. A few researchers and science fiction authors have speculated on an alternate scenario, where life emerges around the silicon atom. Silicon sits directly below carbon on the periodic table, and shares its 4 valence electrons. But silicon lacks carbon's unique versatility, its ability to form the double and triple bonds that create the long chains and rings of fatty acids and sugars. Silicon also requires far more energy to form bonds than carbon does. Tellingly, the Earth contains over 100 times as much silicon as it does carbon, and yet Mother Nature decided to base life on the much rarer element. Silicon-based life may be impossible for one other reason: silicon bonds readily dissolve in water. Most theories of life's origin depend on H20 not merely because hydrogen and oxygen are important elements in many organic compounds, but also because the environment of liquid water facilitated the early chemistry experiments that led to the emergence of life. The Miller-Urey experiment was, in a way, an attempt to test more rigorously a hunch that Charles Darwin had had a century before about the watery origins of life. In a letter to the botanist Joseph Hooker, Darwin speculated that life had first emerged in some warm little pond, with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity. Most theories of life's origins incorporate some variation of the primordial soup, an environment where novel combinations could occur thanks to the swirl and flow of liquid. Carbon may be a talented connector, but without a medium that allows it to collide randomly with other elements, those connective powers are likely to go to waste. All those spectacular polymer chains would remain unrealized, hidden behind the locked doors of the adjacent possible. Like carbon, the H2O molecule possesses several exceptional properties that make the medium of liquid water uniquely suited to sustain early life. The hydrogen bonds that form between distinct water molecules are about 10 times stronger than equivalent bonds in normal liquids, which gives the medium several crucial properties. For starters, the temperature range at which water remains in liquid form is much larger than that of almost every other substance, thanks in part to those hydrogen bonds, thus preventing the oceans from boiling away during the early days of life on Earth. Water is also a fiendishly talented dissolver of things. The combination of water's fluidity and solubility makes it marvelously adept at creating new networks of elements, as they churn through the ever-shifting medium, colliding with each other in unpredictable ways. At the same time, the strength of the hydrogen bonds means that new combinations with some stability to them, many of them anchored around carbon atoms, can endure and seek out additional connections in the soup. And so, when we look back to the original innovation engine on Earth, we find 2 essential properties. First, a capacity to make new connections with as many other elements as possible. And, second, a randomizing environment that encourages collisions between all the elements in the system. On Earth, at least, the story of life's creativity begins with a liquid, high-density network, connection-hungry carbon atoms colliding with other elements in the primordial soup. The molecules they formed marked the point at which chemistry and physics gave way to biology. When the first lipids self-assembled, they unlocked a door that would ultimately lead to the cell membrane. When the first nucleotides formed, a wing of the adjacent possible opened that eventually traced a path to DNA. They were the first hints of life's good idea. The computer scientist Christopher Langton observed several decades ago that innovative systems have a tendency to gravitate toward the edge of chaos, the fertile zone between too much order and too much anarchy. Langton sometimes uses the metaphor of different phases of matter, gas, liquid, solid, to describe these network states. Think of the behavior of molecules in each of these three conditions. In a gas, chaos rules, new configurations are possible, but they are constantly being disrupted and torn apart by the volatile nature of the environment. In a solid, the opposite happens. The patterns have stability, but they are incapable of change. But a liquid network creates a more promising environment for the system to explore the adjacent possible. New configurations can emerge through random connections formed between molecules, but the system isn't so wildly unstable that it instantly destroys its new creation. Those connective carbon atoms swirling in the primordial soup formed a high-density liquid network. The 100 billion neurons in your brain form another kind of liquid network, densely interconnected, constantly exploring new patterns, but also capable of preserving useful structures for long periods of time. There is a prediction lurking in this idea of the liquid network, as well as in the premise that innovative environments share signature patterns at different scales. The prediction is that whenever human beings first organized themselves into settlements that resembled liquid networks, a great flowering of innovation would have immediately followed. For ages, early humans lived in the cultural equivalent of gaseous networks, small packs of hunter-gatherers bouncing around the landscape, with almost no contact between groups. But the rise of agriculture changed all that. For the first time, humans began forming groups that numbered in the thousands or tens of thousands. After millennia of living in an intimate cluster of extended family, they began sharing a space crowded with strangers. With that increase in population came a crucial increase in the number of possible connections that could be formed within the group. Good ideas could more readily find their way into other brains and take root there. New forms of collaboration became possible. Economists have a telling phrase for the kind of sharing that happens in these densely populated environments: information spillover. When you share a common civic culture with thousands of other people, good ideas have a tendency to flow from mind to mind, even when their creators try to keep them secret. Spillover is the right word. It captures the essential liquidity of information in dense settlements. As species go, Homo sapiens had been on a fairly good run in the million years that led up to the birth of agriculture. Its members had invented spoken language, art, sophisticated tools for hunting, and cooking. But until they settled in cities, they had not figured out a way to live inside a high-density liquid network. What happened when they did? To grasp the magnitude of the change, we need to put it in some kind of perspective by measuring the speed of innovation before the first cities were settled. So let us condense 70,000 years of innovation into a single timeline, ending circa 2000 BC, a few millennia after the first true cities formed. Looking at the past from this perspective makes one thing clear: somewhere within 1,000 years of the first cities emerging, human beings invented a whole new way of inventing. A strong correlation exists between those dense settlements and the dramatic surge in the societal innovation rate. But is there a causal relationship between the two? The chart alone cannot tell us, and we do not know enough about the specific histories of these innovations to document how essential the urban context was to their creation. But the circumstantial evidence is strong. No doubt some ingenious hunter-gatherer stumbled across the cleansing properties of ashes mixed with animal fat, or dreamed of building aqueducts in those long eons before the rise of cities, and we simply have no record of his epiphany. But the lack of a record is exactly the point. In a low-density, chaotic network, ideas come and go. In the dense networks of the first cities, good ideas have a natural propensity to get into circulation. They spill over, and through that spilling they are preserved for future generations. For reasons we will see. High-density liquid networks make it easier for innovation to happen, but they also serve the essential function of storing those innovations. Before writing, before books, before Wikipedia, the liquid network of cities preserved the accumulated wisdom of human culture. The pattern was repeated in the explosion of commercial and artistic innovation that emerged in the densely settled hill towns of northern Italy, the birthplace of the European Renaissance. Once again, the rise of urban networks triggers a dramatic increase in the flow of good ideas. It is not a coincidence that northern Italy was the most urbanized region in all of Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. But, in a crucial sense, the pattern of Renaissance innovation differs from that of the first cities. Michelangelo, Brunelleschi, and Da Vinci were emerging from a medieval culture that suffered from too much order. If dispersed tribes of hunter-gatherers are the cultural equivalent of a chaotic, gaseous state, a culture where the information is largely passed down by monastic scribes stands at the opposite extreme. A cloister is as solid. By breaking up those information bonds and allowing ideas to circulate more freely through a wider, connected population, the great Italian innovators brought new life to the European mind. Historians have long noted the connection between the artistic and scientific flowering of the Renaissance and the formation of early merchant capitalism in the region, which of course involved its own set of innovations in banking, accounting, and insurance. To be sure, capitalism accelerated the growth of the Italian cities and created surplus wealth that was then deployed to support artists and architects like Michelangelo and Brunelleschi. But the connection between capitalism and innovation is more subtle than we often make it out to be. Yes, free markets introduce new forms of competition and capital accumulation that can drive the creation and adoption of new ideas. But markets should not be exclusively defined in terms of the profit motive. Consider the invention of one of capitalism's key conceptual tools, double-entry accounting, which Goethe called one of the finest inventions of the human mind. Now the cornerstone of all financial bookkeeping, double-entry's innovation of recording every financial event in two ledgers allowed merchants to track the financial health of their businesses with unparalleled accuracy. First codified by the Franciscan friar and mathematician Luca Pacioli in 1494, the double-entry method had been used for at least 2 centuries by Italian bankers and merchants. We do not know if the method originated in the mind of a single visionary proto-accountant, or whether the idea emerged simultaneously in the minds of multiple entrepreneurs, or whether it was passed on by Islamic entrepreneurs who may have experimented with the technique centuries before. Whatever its roots, the technique first became commonplace in the trade capitals of Italy, Genoa, Venice, and Florence, as the merchants of the early Renaissance shared tips among themselves on how best to manage their finances. What makes the history of double entry so fascinating is the simple fact that no one seems to have claimed ownership of the technique, despite its immense value to a capitalist enterprise. One of the essential instruments in the creation of modern capitalism appears to have been developed collectively, circulating through the liquid networks of Italy's cities. Double-entry accounting made it far easier to keep track of what you owned, but no one owned double-entry accounting itself. The idea was too powerful not to spill over into other nearby minds. Double-entry accounting illustrates a key principle in the emergence of markets. When economic systems shift from feudal structures to the nascent forms of modern capitalism, they become less hierarchical and more networked. A society organized around marketplaces, instead of castles or cloisters, distributes decision-making authority across a much larger network of individual minds. The innovation power of the marketplace derives, in part, from this most elemental math. No matter how smart the authorities may be, if they are outnumbered 1,000 to 1 by the marketplace, there will be more good ideas lurking in the market than in the feudal castle. Cities and markets recruit more minds into the collective project of exploring the adjacent possible. As long as there is spillover between those minds, useful innovations will be more likely to appear and spread through the population at large. In thinking about networked innovation this way, I am specifically not talking about a global brain or a hive mind. There are indeed some problems that are wonderfully solved by collective thinking: the formation of neighborhoods and cities, the variable signals of market pricing, the elaborate engineering feats of the social insects. But as many critics have pointed out, most recently, the computer scientist and musician Jaron Lanier, large collectives are rarely capable of true creativity or innovation. When the first market towns emerged in Italy, they didn't magically create some higher-level group consciousness. They simply widened the pool of minds that could come up with and share good ideas. This is not the wisdom of the crowd, but the wisdom of someone in the crowd. It's not that the network itself is smart, it's that the individuals get smarter because they're connected to the network. In 1964, Arthur Koestler published his epic account of innovation's roots, The Act of Creation. The book was an attempt to explain how breakthrough ideas in science and art come about. Koestler's survey extends from Archimedes to Einstein, from Milton to Joyce, and his analysis is unfailingly interesting, often brilliant. Yet across such a wide-ranging survey, one pattern recurs with a surprising regularity. The act of creation, in Koestler's account, is something that happens exclusively in the mind. He spends almost no time discussing the many habitats that sustain or encourage innovation. The book's index, for instance, lacks a single reference to that great engine of supercreativity, the city. Koestler was a great believer in the creative power that emerges when different intellectual disciplines collide. But he seems to have had little interest in the environments that make those collisions possible: living environments, office environments, media environments. On a basic level, it is true that ideas happen inside minds, but those minds are invariably connected to external networks that shape the flow of information and inspiration out of which great ideas are fashioned. Koestler was hardly alone in his interest in the roots of scientific breakthrough. Thomas Kuhn's even more influential book The Structure of Scientific Revolutions had been published 2 years before The Act of Creation. Since those 2 books were published, countless dissertations and scholarly essays have explored the psychology and sociology of scientific progress. Some focused on biographical accounts of legendary scientists at work. Others tested theories through lab experiments that simulated the kind of cognitive work involved in scientific discovery. Others conducted extensive interviews with prominent researchers, asking them to recall the details of their eureka moments and private paradigm shifts. In the early 1990s, a psychologist at McGill University named Kevin Dunbar decided to take another approach. Instead of reading biographies or theorizing in the lab or listening to scientists recount their greatest hits, he would actually watch them as they worked. Dunbar's research style was closer to the reality show Big Brother than it was to traditional philosophy of science. He set up cameras in 4 leading molecular biology laboratories and recorded as much of the action as possible. He also conducted extensive interviews in which the researchers described the latest developments in their experiments and their shifting hypotheses, all in the present tense. The taping and in medias res interviews allowed Dunbar to get around one of the major failings of traditional studies that rely on retrospective interviews. People tend to condense the origin stories of their best ideas into tidy narratives, forgetting the messy, convoluted routes to inspiration that they actually followed. Dunbar called his approach in vivo, as opposed to the more traditional in vitro approach to studying scientific cognition. In other words, Dunbar wasn't studying idea formation in an artificial petri dish environment. He was studying it in the wild. Dunbar and his team transcribed all the interactions and coded each exchange using a classification scheme that allowed them to track patterns in the flow of information through the lab. In group interactions, for instance, exchanges between scientists could be formally coded as clarification or agreement and elaboration or questioning. Most important, Dunbar tracked the conceptual changes that occurred over the course of each project, a researcher baffled by persistent problems in achieving a stable control result, who suddenly realizes that the control problem could be the basis for a whole new experiment, an exchange between 2 scientists working on different projects who recognize a surprising and important connection between their work. The most striking discovery in Dunbar's study turned out to be the physical location where most of the important breakthroughs occurred. With a science like molecular biology, we inevitably have an image in our heads of the scientist alone in the lab, hunched over a microscope, and stumbling across a major new finding. But Dunbar's study showed that those isolated eureka moments were rarities. Instead, most important ideas emerged during regular lab meetings, where a dozen or so researchers would gather and informally present and discuss their latest work. If you looked at the map of idea formation that Dunbar created, the ground zero of innovation was not the microscope. It was the conference table. Dunbar uncovered a set of interactions that consistently led to important breakthroughs during lab conversation. The group environment helped recontextualize problems, as questions from colleagues forced researchers to think about their experiments on a different scale or level. Group interactions challenged researchers' assumptions about their more surprising findings, making them less likely to dismiss them as experimental error. In group problem-solving sessions, Dunbar writes, the results of one person's reasoning became the input to another person's reasoning, resulting in significant changes in all aspects of the way the research was conducted. Productive analogies between different specialized fields were more likely to emerge in the conversational setting of the lab meeting. Dunbar's research suggests one vaguely reassuring thought. Even with all the advanced technology of a leading molecular biology lab, the most productive tool for generating good ideas remains a circle of humans at a table, talking shop. The lab meeting creates an environment where new combinations can occur, where information can spill over from one project to another. When you work alone in an office, peering into a microscope, your ideas can get trapped in place, stuck in your own initial biases. The social flow of the group conversation turns that private solid state into a liquid network. Dunbar's generative conference room meetings remind us that the physical architecture of our work environments can have a transformative effect on the quality of our ideas. The quickest way to freeze a liquid network is to stuff people into private offices behind closed doors, which is one reason so many web-era companies have designed their work environments around common spaces where casual mingling and interdepartmental chatter happens without any formal planning. The idea, of course, is to strike the right balance between order and chaos. Inspired by the early hype about telecommuting, the advertising agency TBWA, Chiat, they experimented with a non-territorial office where desks and cubicles were jettisoned. Along with the private offices, employees had no fixed location in the office and were encouraged to cluster in new, ad hoc configurations with their colleagues depending on that day's projects. By all accounts, it was a colossal failure, precisely because it traded excessive order for excessive chaos. Slightly less ambitious open office plans have grown increasingly unfashionable in recent years, for one compelling reason: people don't like to work in them. To work in an open office is to work exclusively in public, which turns out to have just as many drawbacks as working entirely in your private lab. A better model might be MIT's legendary Building 20, the temporary structure built during World War II that somehow managed to last 55 years, in part because it had an extraordinary track record for cultivating both breakthrough ideas and organizations like Noam Chomsky's linguistics department, Bose Acoustics, and the Digital Equipment Corporation. As MIT wrote in a press release commemorating the building's remarkable history, not assigned to any one school, department, or center, it seems to always have had space for the beginning project, the graduate students' experiment, the interdisciplinary research center. The magic of Building 20, powerfully eulogized in Stuart Brand's How Buildings Learn, lay in the balance the environment struck between order and chaos. There were walls and doors and offices, as in most academic buildings. But the structure's temporary origins, it was originally built with the expectation that it would be torn down after 5 years, meant that those structures could be reconfigured with little bureaucratic fuss as new ideas created new purposes for the space. Because they are fixed physical structures, most offices have a natural tendency to disrupt liquid networks of information. They themselves are, quite literally, made out of solids, and they often map out the conceptual solid of a formal org chart with its neatly defined departments and hierarchies. Building 20 resisted those calcifying forces for a simple reason. It was built on the cheap, which meant its residents had no qualms about tearing down a wall or punching a hole in the ceiling to adapt the space to a new idea. But architects and interior designers are learning how to build work environments that facilitate liquid networks in more permanent structures. In November of 2007, Microsoft opened the doors to the new Redmond, Washington-based headquarters of its research division, Building 99. Created by a Microsoft designer named Martha Clarkson after deep collaboration with the tinkerers and multidisciplinarians of the research division, Building 99 was created from the ground up to be reinvented by the unpredictable flow of collaboration and inspiration. All the office spaces are modular, with walls that can be easily reconfigured to match the needs of the employees. Larger situation rooms house groups working on high-priority projects, with a mix of private workstations, conference tables, and sofa. Most walls are write-on, wipe-off, so if inspiration hits on the way to the restroom, you can quickly sketch out an idea for your colleagues to see. The traditional kitchenette with a coffee pot and refrigerator is replaced by open mixer stations where employees gather to share ideas or gossip. In a sense, Clarkson built the water coolers first, and then designed an office building around them. 2 decades ago, the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi proposed the concept of flow to describe the internal state of energized focus that characterizes the mind at its most productive. It's a lovely metaphor, precisely because it suggests the essential fluidity that good ideas so often need. Flow is not the singular intensity of focusing like a laser, as we often say, and it is not the miraculous illumination of a sudden brainstorm. Rather, it is more the feeling of drifting along a stream, being carried in a clear direction, but still tossed in surprising ways by the eddies and whirls of moving water. But standing in the atrium of Building 99, it's impossible not to think that this space was designed to conjure up a different kind of flow. The collective flow of energized minds forming liquid networks in their mixing spaces and situation rooms. Building 99, like Building 20 before it, is a space that sees information spillover as a feature, not a flaw. It is designed to leak. In this, it shares some core values with the liquid networks of dense cities. No, a closed office at one of the world's richest corporations will never have the open-ended collisions and vitality that a city sidewalk has. But those are extreme points on a continuum. What is important in a structure like Building 99 is what it has learned about flow from those urban environments, and from temporary structures like Building 20. A corporate office building will never recreate 14th century Genoa, or even 20th century Greenwich Village. But office design is moving in that direction, away from the crystal palaces of organization man, with their corner offices and anonymous cubicles. And with that increased fluidity, all those new ideas jostling against each other, and rooms expanding and contracting to meet their needs, it's not hard to imagine the space generating a reliable flow of innovation in the years to come. Exploring the adjacent possible can be as simple as opening a door, but sometimes you need to move a wall. Chapter 3. The Slow Hunch. On July 10, 2001, an Arizona-based FBI field agent named Ken Williams filed an electronic communication with his superiors in Washington and New York, using the Bureau's automated case support system, the antiquated electronic repository through which the Bureau shared information about ongoing investigations. The 6-page document began with this prophetic sentence: "The purpose of this communication is to advise the Bureau in New York of the possibility of a coordinated effort by USAMA bin Laden to send students to the United States to attend civil aviation universities and colleges." This was the now legendary Phoenix Memo, a warning shot fired and largely ignored during the lazy summer months leading up to 9/11. Ironically, the very day that Williams filed his memo, the New York Times ran an op-ed titled, "The Declining Terrorist Threat." Williams had been inspired to write the memo by a pattern he had detected over the preceding year. An inordinate number of people of investigative interest who had registered for various flight schools and other civil aviation colleges in Arizona. Williams had conducted interviews with several of these subjects, including one Zakaria Mustafa Sabra, an aeronautical engineering student on an F1 visa from the UK. Sabra had pictures of bin Laden in his home and told Williams that he believed the U.S. forces and embassies attacked in the Gulf and in Africa had been legitimate military targets of Islam. Williams also suggested that 9 other students from Algeria, Kenya, India, Saudi Arabia, and other Middle Eastern states had enrolled in flight schools and possessed extensive ties to radical Islamic movement. 2 of them apparently were acquaintances of Hani Hanjar, who would be at the controls of American Airlines Flight 77 when it crashed into the Pentagon on the morning of September 11th. Williams failed to anticipate the immediacy of the threat. The memo suggests a long-term plan that would establish a cadre of individuals who will one day be working in the civil aviation community around the world. These individuals will be in a position in the future to conduct terror activity against civil aviation targets. Williams thought that Al-Qaeda might be plotting a measured infiltration of the airline industry. He failed to imagine the brute force hijacking that was to unfold just 2 months later. But his recommendations were right on target. Williams argued that the FBI should assemble a comprehensive list of all flight schools and other aviation institutions around the country, and flag anyone attempting to obtain a visa to attend one of these schools. Though it had been addressed to several high-level offices, including that of David Frasca, the head of the radical fundamentalist unit in D.C., Williams's memo quickly entered what investigators later dubbed a black hole at FBI headquarters. For nearly 3 weeks, it remained in limbo before it was finally assigned to an analyst to review. The analyst labeled it routine instead of urgent. Another agent in New York called it speculative and not very significant, though it was standard for analysts to then pass on reports of this ilk to their superiors. The memo never reached RFU Chief Frasca. When word of the memo first leaked during 2002, intelligence and law enforcement officials were quick to dismiss Williams's warning, calling it nothing more than a hunch. He made a recommendation that we initiate a program to look at flight schools that was received at headquarters. FBI Chief Robert Mueller testified. It was not acted on by September 11th. I should say in passing that even if we had followed those suggestions at that time, it would not, given what we know since September 11, have enabled us to prevent the attacks of September 11. Both statements about the Phoenix memo are demonstrably true. Williams had a hunch about terrorist groups and flight schools, and that hunch on its own would not have been enough to prevent the attacks of September 11. But dismissing it on those grounds fundamentally misses the point. Williams stumbled across a provocative and surprising idea that was nonetheless incomplete. But if that hunch had connected with another equally provocative idea, one that emerged 3 weeks later and 500 miles away, the Phoenix memo might well have transformed the history of the early 21st century. You can learn a great deal about the history of innovation by examining great ideas that change the world. Indeed, most intellectual histories are structured in exactly this fashion, a narrative of breakthroughs and insights and eureka moments that had a transformative impact on human society. But because those ideas were by definition successful ones, it's tempting to attribute their success to intrinsic causes, the sheer brilliance of the idea itself, or the sheer brilliance of the mind that came up with it. But those intrinsic causes can easily overshadow the environmental role in the creation and spread of those ideas. This is why it is just as useful to look at the sparks that fail, the ideas that found their way to a promising region of the adjacent possible but somehow collapsed there. The Phoenix Memo was precisely one of those failed sparks. It contained great wisdom and foresight. In July of 2001, Ken Williams was probably closer to the 9/11 plot than any human being on the planet, save the perpetrators themselves. But that information proved to be ultimately useless. Why? The simple answer is that no one implemented Williams's recommendations, in part because the memo itself had failed to persuade the mid-tier analysts of its importance, and in part because a communications failure inside the FBI kept the memo from reaching the top brass at counterterrorism and the RFU. But even if the memo had reached David Frasca in mid-July, and somehow persuaded him that Ken Williams was onto something, it almost certainly would have failed to stop the 9/11 plot, because it would have taken months to cross-reference all the visa applications with the enrollment records for flight schools across the country. Detecting such subtle patterns in real time was the unrealized goal of the much-criticized Total Information Awareness Project spearheaded by Admiral John Poindexter in the years immediately after 9/11. But in 2001, FBI agents could barely send email to each other, much less cross-reference visa applications with flight school attendance records. This is the technicality that allowed Robert Mueller to testify that following the recommendations of the Phoenix Memo would have done nothing to stop the 9/11 attacks. Looking for unusual visa applications and flight school attendees might well have led the Bureau to the hijackers. But there was no information architecture in place that could have successfully executed that kind of query in a matter of weeks. And so, by that standard, Ken Williams's hunch was not enough on its own to prevent 9/11. But the Phoenix Memo might well have been instrumental in stopping the attacks had it followed a pattern that recurs throughout the history of world-changing ideas. It was a hunch that needed to collide with another hunch. Exactly 1 month after Ken Williams filed his memo, Zacharias Moussaoui enrolled at Pan Am International Flight Academy on the outskirts of St. Paul, Minnesota, where he began training to fly a Boeing 747-400 on a simulator. Instructors and other employees at the flight school were immediately suspicious about their new pupil, who paid his entire $8,300 fee in cash. Moussaoui possessed an inordinate amount of interest in the operation of the cockpit doors and flight tour communications, despite the fact that he claimed no interest in ever flying a real plane. The Pan Am employees contacted the FBI, and after a quick background check, Moussaoui was arrested on immigration violations at a motel on August 16. An interrogation convinced the field agents, led by Harry Samet and Greg Jones, that Moussaoui posed an active threat and might be part of a wider conspiracy. The Minnesota office of the FBI then began a frantic, and ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to obtain a search warrant to examine the files on Moussaoui's laptop. On August 21, the request to seek a search warrant was formally denied on the grounds that the evidence for probable cause was shaky, just another hunch from the hinterlands. For the next week, the Minneapolis office implored headquarters to get access to Moussaoui's laptop, to no avail. Agent Jones at one point warned that Moussaoui might try to fly something into the World Trade Center. The search warrant would not be granted until the afternoon of September 11, after Jones's vision turned out to be all too prescient. This is a story of two hunches. Ken Williams's hunch that a plot involving multiple radical Islamic fundamentalists could be intercepted by tracking visa application and flight school enrollment records, and the Minneapolis field agent's hunch that Moussaoui wanted to fly a plane into the World Trade Center. The latter began, of course, with another hunch, the Pan Am school instructors' hunch that Zacharias Moussaoui was not being honest about his interest in using a 747 simulator. On their own, they were indeed hunches. On their own, the evidence for their validity was indeed shaky. But contemplating them together amplified their persuasive power dramatically. Connecting the dots between them would have certainly supplied enough probable cause to justify examining the contents of Zacharias Moussaoui's laptop. And had the agents examined his belongings, they would have uncovered direct connections to 11 of the 9/11 hijackers, along with Western Union wire transfer numbers tracking recent payments from Ramzi bin al-Shibh, one of the central coordinators of the 9/11 attack. We cannot know for certain whether that information alone would have led the authorities to Mohammed Atta in time, or whether a more aggressive interrogation of Moussaoui himself might have elicited a confession that would have unraveled the plot. Certainly it is within the realm of possibility. What is undeniable is that in late August of 2001, the only real hope for stopping the attacks lay in connecting these two hunches. The failed spark of the Phoenix memo suggests an answer to the mystery of superlinear scaling in cities and on the web. A metropolis shares one key characteristic with the web. Both environments are dense, liquid networks where information easily flows along multiple unpredictable paths. Those interconnections nurture great ideas, because most great ideas come into the world half-baked, more hunch than revelation. Genuine insights are hard to come by. It's challenging to imagine a terrorist plot to fly passenger planes into buildings, or to invent a programmable computer. And so, most great ideas first take shape in a partial, incomplete form. They have the seeds of something profound, but they lack a key element that can turn the hunch into something truly powerful. And more often than not, that missing element is somewhere else, living as another hunch in another person's head. Liquid networks create an environment where those partial ideas can connect. They provide a kind of dating service for promising hunches. They make it easier to disseminate good ideas, of course, but they also do something more sublime. They help complete ideas. The real problem with Ken Williams's hunch was not that it failed to envision the exact details or the imminence of the 9/11 plot, or even that his recommendations would have failed to prevent the plot had they been followed. The problem with Ken Williams's hunch was environmental. Instead of circulating through a dense network, the Phoenix memo was dropped into the black hole of the automated case support system. Instead of seeking out new connections, the Phoenix memo was deposited in the equivalent of a locked file cabinet. Hunches that don't connect are doomed to stay hunches. There is a fundamental difference between the Phoenix and Minnesota hunches, though, and that difference is time. The flight instructors had a bad feeling about AQUI in a matter of hours. Something just seemed unsettling about his manner and the questions he asked. Ken Williams, on the other hand, developed his hunch about the flight school threat over years of investigation. The Phoenix memo was not the result of a gut impression. It was an idea that slowly took shape over time, a pattern detected after countless hours of observation and inquiry. The Minnesota hunch has become intellectually fashionable in recent years. The gut instinct, the emotional brain flash assessment of a situation that defies the slower calculations of logic, but which nonetheless turns out to be uncannily accurate. The interest in this kind of hunch dates back to the 1980s and Antonio Damasio's experiments with brain-damaged patients whose inability to make intuitive snap judgments produced startlingly irrational behavior. Malcolm Gladwell's bestseller Blink focused almost exclusively on the power of the instant hunch. The art historian who knows in a second that the ancient sculpture is a fraud. The NYPD officer who makes a disastrous snap judgment that a suspect is reaching for a gun when he is actually reaching for his wallet. But the snap judgments of intuition, as powerful as they can be, are rarities in the history of world-changing ideas. Most hunches that turn into important innovations unfold over much longer time frames. They start with a vague, hard-to-describe sense that there's an interesting solution to a problem that hasn't yet been proposed. And they linger in the shadows of the mind, sometimes for decades, assembling new connections and gaining strength. And then one day they are transformed into something more substantial, sometimes jolted out by some newly discovered trove of information, or by another hunch lingering in another mind, or by an internal association that finally completes the thought. Because these slow hunches need so much time to develop, they are fragile creatures, easily lost to the more pressing needs of day-to-day issues. But that long incubation period is also their strength, because true insights require you to think something that no one has thought before in quite the same way. Flash judgments are often just that, judgments. Is this guy trustworthy or not? Is the sculpture a fake? A new idea is something larger than that. It's a new perspective on a problem, or a recognition of a new opportunity that has gone unexplored to date. Those kinds of breakthroughs usually take time to develop. When the 18th century scientist Joseph Priestley decided to isolate a mint sprig in a sealed glass in an ingenious experiment that ultimately proved that plants were creating oxygen. One of the founding discoveries of modern ecosystem science. He was building on a hunch that he'd been cultivating for 20 years, dating back to his boyhood obsession with trapping spiders in glass jars. He'd had a hunch that there was something interesting in the way that organisms perished when you sealed them in closed vessels, something that pointed to a larger truth. And he kept that hunch alive until he was ready to make sense of it. This was not a matter of doggedly pursuing a single line of inquiry. During those 20 years, Priestley dabbled in a dozen different fields, concocted hundreds of novel experiments in his home lab, engaged in extensive conversations with the leading intellectuals of the day. A minuscule percentage of that time was devoted directly to the problem of plant respiration. He just kept it alive in the back of his mind. Sustaining the slow hunch is less a matter of perspiration than of cultivation. You give the hunch enough nourishment to keep it growing, and plant it in fertile soil where its roots can make new connections. And then you give it time to bloom. The Vaseline-daubed lens of hindsight tends to blur slow hunches into eureka moments. Inventors, scientists, entrepreneurs, artists, they all like to tell the stories of their great breakthroughs as epiphanies, in part because there is a kind of narrative thrill that comes from that light bulb moment of sudden clarity, and in part because the leisurely background evolution of the slow hunch is much harder to convey. But if one examines the intellectual fossil record closely, the slow hunch is the rule, not the exception. In a famous passage from his autobiography, Darwin describes his great moment of insight as a young man struggling to understand the evolution of life in October 1838, that is, 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry. I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here, then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. This is evolution's version of Newton's apple. Malthus falls out of a tree and hits Darwin on the head, and voila, natural selection is born. In part, the appeal of this eureka story stems from the simple elegance of the theory itself. Unlike more technically intricate scientific breakthroughs, it seems somehow appropriate that the basic evolutionary algorithm should just pop into the mind in a moment of recognition. Darwin's great supporter, T.H. Huxley, is said to have exclaimed, on hearing the natural selection argument for the first time, "How incredibly stupid not to think of that." Darwin's account also possesses a strangely poetic symmetry, because years later, when Alfred Russel Wallace independently hit upon the theory of natural selection, he claimed his breakthrough had been inspired by Malthus as well. For almost a century, the Malthusian Epiphany was the canonical story of Darwinism's roots. But in the early 1970s, a psychologist and intellectual historian named Howard Gruber decided to revisit Darwin's copious notebooks from the period, reconstructing the elaborate dance of speculation, fact-marshalling, and internal debate that led to Darwin's breakthrough in the fall of 1838. What Gruber found in the notebooks was a story very different from the account relayed in Darwin's autobiography. All the core elements of Darwin's theory are present in the notebooks well before the Malthusian Epiphany, which the notebooks explicitly date at September 28, 1838. Darwin understands the importance of variation, the connection between natural and artificial selection, the competition among different species for survival, the clear physiological connections among species, the epic scale of evolutionary time. All these key concepts are discussed at great length in the notebooks from 1837 on. It is not merely that Darwin possesses the puzzle pieces but fails to put them together in the right configuration. In a number of remarkable passages, written many months before the Malthusian insight, he appears to be describing the theory of natural selection in almost full dress. Exactly a year before his Malthus reading, he asks, in shorthand English, whether every animal produces in course of ages 10,000 varieties, and those alone preserved which are well adapted. All it takes to cement a working theory of natural selection is to modify the formula ever so slightly, and clarify that the preservation of well-adapted forms comes from their reproductive success. And yet somehow Darwin fails to understand that he has the solution at his fingertips, and continues his inquiry for another year before getting a theory by which to work. Even after the Malthusian insight, Darwin seems incapable of grasping the full consequences of the theory he has established. The journal entries on September 28 are suitably excited, and do seem to grapple with the fundamental elements of the theory. Population is increase at geometrical ratio in far shorter time than 25. The final cause of all this wedging must be to sort out proper structure and adapt it to change. To do that for form, which Malthus shows is the final effect of this populousness on the energy of man. One may say there is a force like 100,000 wedges trying force every kind of adapted structure into the gaps in the economy of nature, or rather forming gaps by thrusting out weaker ones. But in the days and weeks that follow, Darwin's notes do not suggest a mind that has crossed an intellectual watershed. As Gruber notes, the very next day Darwin writes a long entry on the sexual curiosity of primates that appears to have nothing to do with his new discovery. More than a month passes before he even attempts to write down the governing rules of natural selection. All of which means we cannot say definitively that Darwin hit upon the idea for his theory of natural selection on September 28, 1838. The best we can do is say that he did not possess the idea when he embarked on his inquiry in the summer of 1837, and that he had it in an enduring form by November of 1838. This is not a matter of gaps in the historical record. It is simply hard to pinpoint exactly when Darwin had the idea, because the idea didn't arrive in a flash. It drifted into his consciousness over time, in waves. In the months before the Malthus reading, we could probably say that Darwin had the idea of natural selection in his head, but at the same time was incapable of fully thinking it. This is how slow hunches often mature, by stealth, in small steps. They fade into view. This pattern recurs with the other iconographic story of Darwin's intellectual journey, his formative months observing the strange diversity of the Galapagos Islands during the voyage of the Beagle. To be sure, Darwin's early exploration of the principles of natural selection relied heavily on the striking deviations he had seen between related species on the Galapagos archipelago. Darwin's finches are famous for a reason. But the notebooks written during the Galapagos expedition in October of 1835 have almost no hint of the world-changing theory that they will eventually inspire. In fact, the overwhelming majority of notes from Darwin's sojourn on the Galapagos are geological in nature, far more concerned with Lyell's uniformitarian theory than with the birds and reptiles of the archipelago. He does take extensive notes in his naturalist mode, but all the speculative energy of the Beagle journals is generated by the geology. For Darwin the biologist, the Galapagos days were a fact-finding mission, but Darwin the geologist was consciously processing and interpreting the facts as he gathered them. According to Darwin's own account, he didn't really lock onto the tantalizing puzzle of the finches and their exotic neighbors until the next spring, just as the Beagle was finding safe harbor in the Keeling Islands. His journal for 1837 includes the line, "In July opened first notebook on transmutation of species, had been greatly struck from about month of previous march on character of S. American fossils, and species on Galapagos archipelago. These facts origin of all my views." He had witnessed firsthand the marvelous diversity of species on the Galapagos, and had documented it with a precision that no human had ever attempted before. But it took him 5 months to realize why it was important. Keeping a slow hunch alive poses challenges on multiple scales. For starters, you have to preserve the hunch in your own memory, in the dense network of your neurons. Most slow hunches never last long enough to turn into something useful, because they pass in and out of our memory too quickly, precisely because they possess a certain murkiness. You get a feeling that there's an interesting avenue to explore, a problem that might someday lead you to a solution, but then you get distracted by more pressing matters and the hunch disappears. So part of the secret of hunch cultivation is simple: write everything down. We can track the evolution of Darwin's ideas with such precision because he adhered to a rigorous practice of maintaining notebooks where he quoted other sources, improvised new ideas, interrogated and dismissed false leads, drew diagrams, and generally let his mind roam on the page. We can see Darwin's ideas evolve because on some basic level the notebook platform creates a cultivating space for his hunches. It is not that the notebook is a mere transcription of the ideas, which are happening offstage somewhere in Darwin's mind. Darwin was constantly rereading his notes, discovering new implications. His ideas emerge as a kind of duet between the present tense thinking brain and all those past observations recorded on paper. Somewhere in the middle of the Indian Ocean, a train of association compels him to revisit his notes on the fauna of the Galapagos archipelago from 5 months before. As he reads through his observations, a new thought begins to take shape in his mind, which provokes a whole new set of notes that will only make complete sense to Darwin 2 years later, after the Malthus episode. Darwin's notebooks lie at the tail end of a long and fruitful tradition that peaked in Enlightenment-era Europe, particularly in England: the practice of maintaining a commonplace book. Scholars, amateur scientists, aspiring men of letters, just about anyone with intellectual ambition in the 17th and 18th centuries was likely to keep a commonplace book. The great minds of the period, Milton, Bacon, Locke, were zealous believers in the memory-enhancing powers of the commonplace book. In its most customary form, commonplacing, as it was called, involved transcribing interesting or inspirational passages from one's reading, assembling a personalized encyclopedia of quotations. There is a distinct self-help quality to the early descriptions of commonplacing's virtues. Maintaining the books enabled one to lay up a fund of knowledge, from which we may at all times select what is useful in the several pursuits of life. John Locke first began maintaining a commonplace book in 1652, during his first year at Oxford. Over the next decade he developed and refined an elaborate system for indexing the book's content. Locke thought his method important enough that he appended it to a printing of his canonical work, an essay concerning human understanding. Locke's approach seems almost comical in its intricacy. but it was a response to a specific set of design constraints, creating a functional index in only 2 pages that could be expanded as the commonplace book accumulated more quotes and observations. When I meet with anything that I think fit to put into my commonplace book, I first find a proper head. Suppose, for example, that the head be EPISTOLA. I look unto the index for the first letter and the following vowel, which in this instance are EI. If in the space marked EI, there is any number that directs me to the page designed for words that begin with an E and whose first vowel after the initial letter is I. I must then write under the word epistola in that page what I have to remark. Locke's method proved so popular that a century later, an enterprising publisher named John Bell printed a notebook entitled Bell's Commonplace Book, formed generally upon the principles recommended and practiced by Mr. Locke. The book included 8 pages of instructions on Locke's indexing method, a system which not only made it easier to find passages, but also served the higher purpose of facilitate reflexive thought. Bell's volume would be the basis for one of the most famous commonplace books of the late 18th century, maintained from 1776 to 1787 by Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather. At the very end of his life, while working on a biography of his grandfather, Charles obtained what he called the Great Book from his cousin Reginald. In the biography, the younger Darwin captures the book's marvelous diversity. There are schemes and sketches for an improved lamp, like our present moderators, candlesticks with telescope stands so as to be raised at pleasure to any required height, a manifold writer, a knitting loom for stockings, a weighing machine, a surveying machine, a flying bird, with an ingenious escapement for the movement of the wings, and he suggests gunpowder or compressed air as the motive power. The tradition of the commonplace book contains a central tension between order and chaos, between the desire for methodical arrangement and the desire for surprising new links of association. For some Enlightenment-era advocates, the systematic indexing of the commonplace book became an aspirational metaphor for one's own mental life. The dissenting preacher John Mason wrote in 1745, "Think it not enough to furnish this storehouse of the mind with good thoughts, but lay them up there in order, digested or ranged under proper subjects or classes. At whatever subject you have occasion to think or talk upon, you may have recourse immediately to a good thought, which you heretofore laid up there under that subject, so that the very mention of the subject may bring the thought to hand, by which means you will carry a regular commonplace book in your memory." Others, including Priestley and both Darwins, used their commonplace books as a repository for a vast miscellany of hunches. The historian Robert Darnton describes this tangled mix of writing and reading. Unlike modern readers, who follow the flow of a narrative from beginning to end, early modern Englishmen read in fits and starts and jumped from book to book. They broke texts into fragments and assembled them into new patterns by transcribing them in different sections of their notebook. Then they reread the copies and rearranged the patterns while adding more excerpts. Reading and writing were therefore inseparable activities. They belonged to a continuous effort to make sense of things. For the world was full of signs, you could read your way through it, and by keeping an account of your readings, you made a book of your own, one stamped with your personality. Each rereading of the commonplace book becomes a new kind of revelation. You see the evolutionary paths of all your past hunches, the ones that turned out to be red herrings, the ones that turned out to be too obvious to write, even the ones that turned into entire books. But each encounter holds the promise that some long-forgotten hunch will connect in a new way with some emerging obsession. The beauty of Locke's scheme was that it provided just enough order to find snippets when you were looking for them, but at the same time it allowed the main body of the commonplace book to have its own unruly, unplanned meanderings. Imposing too much order runs the risk of orphaning a promising hunch in a larger project that has died, and it makes it difficult for those ideas to mingle and breed when you revisit them. You need a system for capturing hunches, but not necessarily categorizing them, because categories can build barriers between disparate ideas, restrict them to their own conceptual islands. This is one way in which the human history of innovation deviates from the natural history. New ideas do not thrive on archipelagos. In the bibliographic history of epic miscellany, another British title deserves mention alongside Erasmus Darwin's commonplace book, an immensely popular Victorian how-to guide with the memorable title Inquire Within Upon Everything. The frontispiece text for the book, first published in 1865, hints at the immense collection of domestic resources it contained. Whether you wish to model a flower in wax, to study the rules of etiquette, to serve a relish for breakfast or supper, to supply a delicious entree for the dinner table, to plan a dinner for a large party or a small one, to cure a headache, to make a will, to get married, to bury a relative, whatever you may wish to do, to make, or to enjoy, provided your desire has relation to the necessities of domestic life, I shall be happy to assist you and therefore hope you will not fail to inquire within Editor. Over 100 editions of the guide were published, and it remained a common staple of British households well into the 20th century. One musty copy of the book lingered into the 1960s, in the home of a pair of mathematicians living in the suburbs of London. The couple had a young son who was drawn to the suggestion of magic in the book's title, and who spent hours exploring this portal to the world of information. The title stuck in the back of his mind, along with that wondrous feeling of exploring an immense trove of data. More than a decade later, he was working as a software consultant in a Swiss research lab and found himself overwhelmed by the flow of information and the personnel churn in the organization. As a side project, he began tinkering with an application that would allow him to keep track of all that data. When it came time to give his program a name, his mind drifted back to that strange Victorian household encyclopedia from his youth. He called his application Inquire. The application allowed you to store small blocks of information about people or projects as nodes in a connected network. It was easy to attach two-way pointers between nodes, so if you pulled up a person's name, you could instantly see all the projects he or she was working on. The application proved to be genuinely informative, but the programmer soon switched jobs and abandoned the code. He started up another version, which he called Tangle, a few years later, but it never got off the ground. But then, almost 10 years after he had first programmed Inquire, he began sketching out a more ambitious application that could make connections between documents stored on different computers, using hypertext links. For a while he struggled with the right name for his nascent platform, calling it an information mine or mesh. Eventually, he hit upon a different metaphor for the platform's dense network. He called it the World Wide Web. In his own account of the web's origins, Tim Berners-Lee makes no attempt to collapse the evolution of his marvelous idea into a single epiphany. The web came into being as an archetypal slow hunch, from a child's exploration of a 100-year-old encyclopedia, to a freelancer's idle side project designed to help him keep track of his colleagues, to a deliberate attempt to build a new information platform that could connect computers across the planet. Like Darwin's great understanding of life's tangled web, Berners-Lee's idea needed time, at least a decade's worth, to mature. Journalists have always asked me what the crucial idea was, or what the singular event was, that allowed the web to exist one day when it hadn't the day before. They are frustrated when I tell them there was no eureka moment. Inventing the World Wide Web involved my growing realization that there was a power in arranging ideas in an unconstrained, web-like way. And that awareness came to me through precisely that kind of process. The web arose as the answer to an open challenge, through the swirling together of influences, ideas, and realizations from many sides, until, by the wondrous offices of the human mind, a new concept gelled. It was a process of accretion, not the linear solving of one problem after another. Berners-Lee's slow, accretive development of the web takes us to the next scale of innovation. Cultivating hunches extends beyond the private dominion of memory and the commonplace book. Most people do not have the luxury that Darwin had, of spending an entire life in pursuit of his intellectual fancies. For most people, ideas happen in and around their work environments, with all the daily pressures, distractions, accountability, and constant supervision that work life so often implies. In this respect, Berners-Lee was supremely lucky in the work environment he had settled into, the Swiss particle physics lab CERN. It took him 10 years to nurture his slow hunch about a hypertext information platform. He spent most of those years working at CERN, but it wasn't until 1990, a decade after he had first begun working on Inquire, that CERN officially authorized him to work on the hypertext project. His day job was data acquisition and control. Building a global communications platform was his hobby. Because the two shared some attributes, his superiors at CERN allowed Berners-Lee to tinker with his side project over the years. Thanks to a handful of newsgroups on the internet, Berners-Lee was able to supplement and refine his ideas by conversing with other early hypertext innovators. That combination of flexibility and connection gave Berners-Lee critical support for his idea. He needed a work environment that carved out a space for slow hunches, cordoned off from all the immediate dictates of the day's agenda. And he needed information networks that let those hunches travel to other minds, where they could be augmented and polished. If there is an innovation antimatter to CERN's hunch-sustaining matter, it might well be the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the summer of 2001. There were two crucial networks that failed to make the proper connections in the months leading up to 9/11, the information network of the automated case support system and the neural networks in the brains of the key participants. Even back in 2001, retrieving documents with an unlikely combination of terms, say, for example, flight schools and radical Islamic fundamentalists, was a routine matter. Millions of users of Google, founded 3 years earlier, were doing comparable queries of the entire web with near instantaneous results. Had the information network automatically suggested that the radical fundamentalist unit officials read the Phoenix memo after the Minnesota office began its investigation into AQUI, the last few weeks of summer might have played out very differently. But however smart the network itself could have been, it still required a comparable connection to take place in the minds of the participants. If David Frasca had read the memo that Ken Williams had addressed to him, he might well have been able to connect the two hunches using the advanced pattern recognition technology of the human brain. The failure of those two networks to connect the Phoenix and Minnesota hunches was partly attributable to the practically medieval information technology employed by the FBI. But even if the Bureau had miraculously upgraded its network in the summer of 2001, the two hunches would likely have remained apart because the lack of connections in the automated case support system was a design principle, not merely the result of old-fashioned technology. It was, in computer science parlance, a feature, not a bug. The FBI's information network was a classic closed network. Not only could outsiders not access information in it, but also, the system was designed so that documents were carefully shielded from other members of the organization, a legacy of an institution predicated on secrets and need-to-know restrictions. A final report of the Judiciary Committee investigation into the intelligence failings in the months prior to 9/11 explicitly cited this design principle of the Bureau's information network as one of the key culprits, calling it a stovepipe mentality where crucial intelligence is pigeonholed into a particular unit and may not be shared with other units. In a real sense, the FBI in the months leading up to 9/11 was a hunch-killing system, which is more than a little ironic, given the important role that hunches play in most accounts, real or fictional, of great investigators. In the FBI culture, an analyst labeling a report speculative was enough to keep it from advancing up the chain of command, while the outdated stovepipe architecture kept Williams's hunch from circulating to other field agents working on their own hunches. Tim Berners-Lee's monumental vision at CERN was a tangled web of data, a swirling together of influences, ideas, and realizations from many sides. The automated case support system wasn't just incompetent at creative tangle, the system was explicitly designed to eliminate it. In 1980, to allude to inquire within upon everything in the name of your software package was more than a little audacious. Berners-Lee was just trying to keep track of his colleagues at CERN, not organize all the world's information. But inquire within could well be the slogan for Google, which is why it is strangely appropriate that Google, in its own corporate environment, has arguably done the most to adopt and expand the kind of slow hunch innovation that created the web in the first place. Early in its history, Google famously instituted a 20% time program for all Google engineers. For every 4 hours they spend working on official company projects, the engineers are required to spend 1 hour on their own pet project, guided entirely by their own passions and instincts. The only requirements are that they give semi-regular updates on their progress to their superiors. Most engineers end up drifting from idea to idea, and the vast majority of those ideas never turn into an official Google product. But every now and then, one of those hunches blooms into something significant. AdSense, Google's platform that allows bloggers and web publishers to run Google ads on their sites, was partially generated during 20% time. In 2009, AdSense was responsible for more than $5 billion of Google's earnings, nearly a third of their total for the year. Orkut, one of the largest social network sites in India and Brazil, originated in the innovation time off of a Turkish Google engineer named Orkut Bayakoktan. Google's popular mail platform, Gmail, has roots in an innovation time off project as well. Marissa Mayer, Google's vice president of search products and user experience, claims that over 50% of Google's new products derive from innovation time-off hunches. The most telling contrast between Google and the FBI lies in the story of Krishna Bharat, who now holds the title of principal scientist at Google. In the weeks after 9/11, Bharat found himself overwhelmed by the amount of news information available about the attacks and the imminent war in Afghanistan. It occurred to him that it would be useful to create a software tool that could organize all those stories into useful clusters of relevance, so that you could see at a glance all the latest stories from around the web about the search for bin Laden, or the cleanup efforts at Ground Zero, or the Bush administration's case for military retaliation. Bharat decided to use his 20% time to build a system called StoryRank, modeled after the original PageRank algorithm that Google's search engine relies on to organize and cluster news items. StoryRank eventually blossomed into Google News, one of the most popular sources of news and commentary on the web. In a sense, the narrative of StoryRank's evolution is the exact mirror image of the narrative of the Phoenix Memo. Like Tim Berners-Lee, Barrett was blessed with an organizational culture that encouraged hunches and gave them the space and time they needed to evolve. And Barrett took that nurturing environment and used it to build a tool that could automatically assemble clusters of relevance and association between documents. Precisely the kind of system that could have connected the dots between the Phoenix Memo and the AQUI investigation. Barrett had a hunch in his mind that there was a better way to organize the information network of news, and what he built turned out to be a tool that could be used to help related hunches complete one another. Google News launched in September of 2002, which means StoryRank went from a hunch in Krishna Bharat's mind to a shipping product in 1 year. 9 years after 9/11, the FBI is still using the automated case support system. Chapter 4. Serendipity. Like any other thought, a hunch is simply a network of cells firing inside your brain in an organized pattern. But for that hunch to blossom into something more substantial, it has to connect with other ideas. The hunch requires an environment where surprising new connections can be forged, the neurons and synapses of the brain itself, and the larger cultural environment that the brain occupies. For many years, a debate raged over the nature of those neural connections. Were they chemical or electrical in nature? Were there chemical soups in the brain, or sparks? The answer turned out to be both. Neurons send electrical signals down the long cables of their axons, which connect to other neurons via small synaptic gaps. When the electrical charge reaches the synapse, it releases a chemical messenger, a neurotransmitter like dopamine or serotonin, that floats across to the receiving neuron and ultimately triggers another electrical charge, which travels out to other neurons in the brain. The hybrid electrochemical nature of nerve communication was first established in another of the 20th century's most celebrated experiments. In the early 1920s, the German scientist Otto Loewi isolated 2 still-beating frog hearts in separate vessels containing a saline solution. In one heart, he attached an electrode to the vagus nerve, which in an intact body starts in the brain stem and extends throughout the body. Because the vagus nerve helps regulate the parasympathetic system, stimulating the nerve with an electric charge slowed the heartbeat down. Loewi then extracted some of the solution that surrounded the heart and poured it over the second heart. Instantly, the second heart began to beat more slowly as well, even though its vagus nerve had not been electrically stimulated. Loewi's ingenious experiment demonstrated that the instructions to slow down the heartbeat had passed through the chemical soup of the saline solution. By stimulating a different part of the frog's vagus nerve, he could also accelerate both heartbeats in the same fashion. We now know that the electrical stimulation was releasing 2 distinct molecules into the soup, acetylcholine and adrenaline. Loewi's experiment, as influential as it was, is now remembered as much for the curious way Loewi conceived of it. The idea for the experiment came to Loewi in a dream, in 2 dreams, to be exact. The night before Easter Sunday of that year I awoke, turned on the light, and jotted down a few notes on a tiny slip of thin paper. Then I fell asleep again. It occurred to me at 6 o'clock in the morning that during the night I had written down something most important, but I was unable to decipher the scrawl. The next night, at 3 o'clock, the idea returned. It was the design of an experiment to determine whether or not the hypothesis of chemical transmission that I had uttered 17 years ago was correct. I got up immediately, went to the laboratory, and performed a simple experiment on a frog heart according to the nocturnal design. We conventionally associate dream inspiration with the creative arts, but the canon of scientific breakthroughs contains many revolutionary ideas that originated in dreams. The Russian scientist Dmitry Mendeleev created the periodic table of the elements after a dream suggested to him that the table could be ordered by atomic weight. It was in a dream in 1947 that Nobel laureate John Carroll Eccles originally conceived his theory of synaptic inhibitory action, which helped explain how connected neurons can fire without triggering an endless cascade of brain activity. Interestingly, Eccles's initial hunch involved a purely electrical system, but later experiments proved that the chemical GABA was central to synaptic inhibition, putting him in agreement with Loewi's experiment of decades before. There is nothing mystical about the role of dreams in scientific discovery. While dream activity remains a fertile domain for research, we note that during REM sleep acetylcholine-releasing cells in the brain stem fire indiscriminately, sending surges of electricity billowing out across the brain. Memories and associations are triggered in a chaotic, semi-random fashion, creating the hallucinatory quality of dreams. Most of those new neuronal connections are meaningless, but every now and then the dreaming brain stumbles across a valuable link that has escaped waking consciousness. In this sense, Freud had it backward with his notion of dream work. The dream is not somehow unveiling a repressed truth. Instead, it is exploring, trying to find new truths by experimenting with novel combinations of neurons. A recent experiment led by the German neuroscientist Ulrich Wagner demonstrates the potential for dream states to trigger new conceptual insights. In Wagner's experiment, test subjects were assigned a tedious mathematical task that involved the repetitive transformation of 8 digits into a different number. With practice, the test subjects grew steadily more efficient at completing the task. But Wagner's puzzle had a hidden pattern to it, a rule that governed the numerical transformations. Once discovered, the pattern allowed the subjects to complete the test much faster, not unlike the surge of activity one gets at the end of a jigsaw puzzle when all the pieces suddenly fall into place. Wagner found that after an initial exposure to the numerical test, sleeping on the problem more than doubled the test subjects' ability to discover the hidden rule. The mental recombinations of sleep helped them explore the full range of solutions to the puzzle, detecting patterns that they had failed to perceive in their initial training period. The work of dreams turns out to be a particularly chaotic, yet productive, way of exploring the adjacent possible. In a sense, dreams are the mind's primordial soup, the medium that facilitates the serendipitous collisions of creative insight. And hunches are like those early carbon atoms, seeking out new kinds of connections to help them build new chains and rings of innovation. Loewy's dream about the frog heart experiment is often invoked as a story of sudden epiphany, a 20th century version of Newton's apple. But the truth is that Loewy had been musing on the idea that nerves might communicate chemically for 17 years. In part, his epiphany was made possible by the random connections of REM sleep. Yet it was also made possible by a slow hunch that had been lingering in the back of his mind for almost 2 decades. This pattern of a slow hunch crystallizing into a dream-inspired epiphany recurs in what may be the most famous reverie in the history of science. In 1865, the German chemist Friedrich August Kekulé von Stradonitz had a daydream by a crackling fire in which he saw a vision of Ouroboros, the serpent from Greek mythology that devours its own tail. Kekulé had spent the past 10 years of his life exploring the connections of carbon-based molecules. The serpent image in his dream gave him a sudden insight into the molecular structure of the hydrocarbon benzene. The benzene molecule, he realized, was a perfect ring of carbon, with hydrogen atoms surrounding its outer edges. Kekulé's slow hunch had set the stage for the insight. But for that hunch to turn into a world-changing idea, he needed the most unlikely of connections, an iconic image from ancient mythology. And Kekulé's vision did indeed prove to be a breakthrough of epic proportions. The ring structure of the benzene molecule became the basis for a revolution in organic chemistry, opening up a new vista onto the mesmerizing array of rings and chains formed by that most connective of elements, carbon. It took the combinatorial serendipity of a daydream, all those neurons firing in unlikely new configurations, to help us understand the combinatorial power of carbon, which was itself crucial to understanding the original innovations of life itself. The waking brain, too, has an appetite for the generative chaos that rules in the dream state. Neurons share information by passing chemicals across the synaptic gap that connects them. But they also communicate via a more indirect channel. They synchronize their firing rates. For reasons that are not entirely understood, large clusters of neurons will regularly fire at the exact same frequency. This is what neuroscientists call phase locking. There is a kind of beautiful synchrony to phase locking. Millions of neurons pulsing in perfect rhythm. But the brain also seems to require the opposite, regular periods of electrical chaos, where neurons are completely out of sync with each other. If you follow the various frequencies of brain wave activity with an EEG, the effect is not unlike turning the dial on an AM radio, periods of structured, rhythmic patterns, interrupted by static and noise. The brain's systems are tuned for noise, but only in controlled bursts. In 2007, Robert Thatcher, a brain scientist at the University of South Florida, decided to study the vacillation between phase lock and noise in the brains of dozens of children. While Thatcher found that the noise periods lasted, on average, for 55 milliseconds, he also detected statistically significant variation among the children. Some brains had a tendency to remain longer in phase lock. Others had noise intervals that regularly approached 60 milliseconds. When Thatcher then compared the brain wave results with the children's IQ scores, he found a direct correlation between the two data sets. Every extra millisecond spent in the chaotic mode added as much as 20 IQ points. Longer spells in phase lock deducted IQ points, though not as dramatically. Thatcher's study suggests a counterintuitive notion. The more disorganized your brain is, the smarter you are. It's counterintuitive in part because we tend to attribute the growing intelligence of the technology world with increasingly precise electromechanical choreography. Intel doesn't advertise its latest microprocessors with the slogan, every 55 milliseconds. Our chips erupt into a blizzard of noise, yet somehow brains that seek out that noise seem to thrive, at least by the measure of the IQ test. Science does not yet have a solid explanation for the brain's chaos states, but Thatcher and other researchers believe that the electric noise of the chaos mode allows the brain to experiment with new links between neurons that would otherwise fail to connect in more orderly settings. The phase lock mode is where the brain executes an established plan or habit. The chaos mode is where the brain assimilates new information, explores strategies for responding to a changed situation. In this sense, the chaos mode is a kind of background dreaming, a wash of noise that makes new connections possible. Even in our waking hours, it turns out, our brains gravitate toward the noise and chaos of dreams, 55 milliseconds at a time. William James, writing in the late 1880s, had no way of measuring synchronized neuron firing, but his description of the highest order of minds captures something of the chaos mode. Instead of thoughts of concrete things patiently following one another, we have the most abrupt crosscuts and transitions from one idea to another, the most rarefied abstractions and discriminations, the most unheard of combinations of elements. A seething cauldron of ideas, where everything is fizzling and bobbing about in a state of bewildering activity, where partnerships can be joined or loosened in an instant, treadmill routine is unknown, and the unexpected seems the only law. The act of sexual reproduction is itself a kind of testament to the power of random connections, even in the most monogamous relationships. The overwhelming majority of non-microscopic life on Earth produces offspring by sharing genes with another organism. But the evolution of this reproductive strategy remains something of a mystery. It would have been far easier for life to have avoided the complicated genetic exchanges of meiosis and fertilization. Think of the elaborate system that the flowering plants had to evolve, luring insects to take on the task of carrying pollen from flower to flower. Reproduction without sex is a simple matter of cloning. You take your own cells, make a copy, and pass that on to your descendants. It doesn't sound like much fun to our mammalian ears, but it's a strategy that has worked very well for billions of years for bacteria. Asexual reproduction is faster and more energy efficient than the sexual variety. You don't need to go to the trouble of finding a partner in order to create the next generation. If natural selection rewarded organisms exclusively for sheer reproductive power, sexual reproduction might never have evolved. Asexual organisms reproduce on average twice as quickly as their sexual counterparts, in part because without a male-female distinction, every organism is capable of producing offspring directly. But evolution is not just a game of sheer quantity. Overpopulation, after all, poses its own dangers, and a community of organisms with identical DNA makes a prime target for parasites or predators. For these reasons, natural selection also rewards innovation. Life's tendency to discover new ecological niches, new sources of energy. This is what Stuart Kauffman recognized when he first formulated the idea of the adjacent possible, that there is something like an essential drive in the biosphere to diversify into new ways of making a living. Scrambling together two distinct sets of DNA with each generation made for a far more complicated reproductive strategy, but it paid immense dividends in the rate of innovation. What we gave up in speed and simplicity, we made up for in creativity. The water flea Daphnia lives in most freshwater ponds and swamps. Its spasmodic movements in the water are responsible for the flea description, but in reality Daphnia are tiny crustaceans, no more than a few millimeters long. Under normal conditions, Daphnia reproduce asexually, with females producing a brood of identical copies of themselves in a tiny pouch. In this mode, the Daphnia community is composed entirely of females. This reproductive strategy proves to be stunningly successful. In warm summer months, Daphnia will often be one of the most abundant organisms in a pond ecosystem. But when conditions get tough, when droughts or other ecological disturbances happen, or when winter rolls in, the water fleas make a remarkable transformation. They start producing males and switch to reproducing sexually. In part, this switch is attributable to the sturdier eggs produced by sexual reproduction, which are more capable of surviving the long months of winter. But scientists believe that the sudden adoption of sex is also a kind of biological innovation strategy. In challenging times, an organism needs new ideas to meet those new challenges. Reproducing asexually makes perfect sense during prosperous periods. If life is good, keep doing what you're doing. Don't mess with success by introducing new genetic combinations. But when the world gets more challenging, scarce resources, predators, parasites, you need to innovate. And the quickest path to innovation lies in making novel connections. This strategy of switching back and forth between asexual and sexual reproduction goes by the name heterogamy, and while it is unusual, many different organisms have adopted it. Slime molds, algae, and aphids have all evolved heterogamous reproductive strategies. In each organism, the Daphnia pattern repeats itself. The genetic recombinations of sex emerge when conditions get difficult. Swapping genes with another organism is itself more difficult than simple cloning. But the innovation rewards of sex outweigh the risks of the more stable path. When nature finds itself in need of new ideas, it strives to connect, not protect. The English language is blessed with a wonderful word that captures the power of accidental connection, serendipity. First coined in a letter written by the English novelist Horace Walpole in 1754. The word derives from a Persian fairy tale titled The Three Princes of Serendip, the protagonists of which were always making discoveries, by accident and sagacity, of things they were not in quest of. The contemporary novelist John Barth describes it in nautical terms. You don't reach serendip by plotting a course for it. You have to set out in good faith for elsewhere and lose your bearings serendipitously. But serendipity is not just about embracing random encounters for the sheer exhilaration of it. Serendipity is built out of happy accidents, to be sure, but what makes them happy is the fact that the discovery you've made is meaningful to you. It completes a hunch, or opens up a door in the adjacent possible that you had overlooked. If you're a geologist randomly exploring the web, and the particular isle of serendip that you stumble across turns out to be an essay on healthcare reform, your discovery may well be interesting and informative, but it will not be truly serendipitous unless it helps you fill in a piece of a puzzle you've been poring over. That's not to say that geologists can only find serendipitous discoveries in texts about geology. Quite the contrary, in fact. Serendipitous discoveries often involve exchanges across traditional disciplines. Think of the way Kekule's mythic serpent led to a revolution in organic chemistry. It was genuinely serendipitous that Kekule's dreaming brain should conjure up the image of Ouroboros at that moment. But had Kekule not been wrestling with the structure of the benzene molecule for years, that serpent shape might not have triggered any useful associations in his mind. Serendipity needs unlikely collisions and discoveries, but it also needs something to anchor those discoveries. Otherwise, your ideas are like carbon atoms randomly colliding with other atoms in the primordial soup without ever forming the rings and lattices of organic life. The challenge, of course, is how to create environments that foster these serendipitous connections on all the appropriate scales, in the private space of your own mind, within larger institutions, and across the information networks of society itself. At first blush, the idea of conjuring up serendipitous discoveries inside your own mind seems like a contradiction in terms. Wouldn't that be like losing your bearings in your own driveway? Yet that's exactly what Kekule was doing by the fire. He was connecting two distinct thoughts that each occupied a slot in his memory banks, the riddle of benzene's molecular structure and the tail-swallowing Ouroboros. The truth is, your mind contains a near infinite number of ideas and memories that at any given moment are lurking outside your consciousness. Some tiny fraction of those thoughts are like Kekule's serpent, surprising connections that might help you unlock a door in the adjacent possible. But how do you get those particular clusters of neurons to fire at the right time? One way is to go for a walk. The history of innovation is replete with stories of good ideas that occurred to people while they were out on a stroll. The shower or stroll removes you from the task-based focus of modern life, paying bills, answering email, helping kids with homework, and deposits you in a more associative state. Given enough time, your mind will often stumble across some old connection that it had long overlooked, and you experience that delightful feeling of private serendipity. Why didn't I think of that before? In his book The Foundations of Science, the French mathematician and physicist Henri Poincaré devotes an autobiographical chapter to the question of mathematical creativity. The chapter begins with a detailed account of how Poincaré discovered the class of Fuchsian functions, one of the first influential mathematical concepts of his career. He begins by attempting to prove that the functions do not exist. For 15 days he struggles at his desk with no success. Then one evening he breaks from his ordinary routine and drinks black coffee. Unable to sleep, his mind seethes with promising hunches. Ideas rose in crowds. Poincaré writes, I felt them collide until pairs interlocked, so to speak, making a stable combination. By the next morning I had established the existence of a class of Fuchsian functions, those which come from the hypergeometric series. His next insight, a connection between the functions and non-Euclidean geometry, comes several weeks later while boarding a bus during a geological expedition in Normandy. On his return home, he commences work on an unrelated arithmetical question and flounders for several days. Disgusted with my failure, he writes, I went to spend a few days at the seaside and thought of something else. One morning, walking on the bluff, the idea came to me, with just the same characteristics of brevity, suddenness, and immediate certainty. That the arithmetic transformations of indeterminate ternary quadratic forms were identical with those of non-Euclidean geometry. He returns home again and works through the implications, but encounters another roadblock. Military service then dictates a trip to Fort Mont-Valérien in the suburbs of Paris, where he has little time to think about mathematics at all. And yet the final missing piece arrives nonetheless. One day, going along the street, the solution of the difficulty which had stopped me suddenly appeared to me. I did not try to go deep into it immediately, and only after my service did I again take up the question. I had all the elements and had only to arrange them and put them together. So I wrote out my final memoir at a single stroke and without difficulty. Poincare's account may be the most pedestrian story of scientific creativity on record. Whenever he actually sits down at his desk, the innovations seem to grind to a halt. But on foot, his ideas rose in crowds. Trying to explain the phenomenon, Poincare reaches for an atomic metaphor, with each partial idea or hunch represented by an atom hooked to a wall. In normal situations, the atoms remain in place, locked into a stable configuration. But when the mind wanders, the atoms become untethered. During a period of apparent rest and unconscious work, certain of them are detached from the wall and put in motion. They flash in every direction through the space, where they are enclosed, as would, for example, a swarm of gnats or, if you prefer a more learned comparison, like the molecules of gas in the kinematic theory of gases. Then their mutual impacts may produce new combinations. While the creative walk can produce new serendipitous combinations of existing ideas in our heads, we can also cultivate serendipity in the way that we absorb new ideas from the outside world. Reading remains an unsurpassed vehicle for the transmission of interesting new ideas and perspectives. But those of us who aren't scholars or involved in the publishing business are only able to block out time to read around the edges of our work schedule, listening to an audiobook during the morning commute, or taking in a chapter after the kids are down. The problem with assimilating new ideas at the fringes of your daily routine is that the potential combinations are limited by the reach of your memory. If it takes you 2 weeks to finish a book, by the time you get to the next book, you've forgotten much of what was so interesting or provocative about the original one. You can immerse yourself in a single author's perspective, but then it's harder to create serendipitous collisions between the ideas of multiple authors. One way around this limitation is to carve out dedicated periods where you read a large and varied collection of books and essays in a condensed amount of time. Bill Gates are famous for taking annual reading vacations. During the year, they deliberately cultivate a stack of reading material, much of it unrelated to their day-to-day focus at Microsoft, and then they take off for a week or two and do a deep dive into the words they've stockpiled. By compressing their intake into a matter of days, they give new ideas additional opportunities to network among themselves, for the simple reason that it's easier to remember something that you read yesterday than it is to remember something you read 6 months ago. In Poincare's language, the deep dive, like the long stroll, detaches the atoms from the wall and puts them in motion. Most of us don't have the luxury of taking deep dive reading sabbaticals, of course, and reading a few thousand pages is not everyone's idea of a fun vacation. But there's no reason why organizations couldn't recognize the value of a reading sabbatical, the way many organizations encourage their employees to take time off for learning new skills. If Google can give its engineers 1 day a week to work on anything they want, surely other organizations can figure out a way to give their employees dedicated time to immerse themselves in a network of new ideas. Private serendipity can be cultivated by technology as well. For more than a decade now, I have been curating a private digital archive of quotes that I've found intriguing, my 21st century version of the commonplace book. Some of these passages involve very focused research on a specific project. Others are more random discoveries, hunches waiting to make a connection. Some of them are passages that I've transcribed from books or articles. Others were clipped directly from web pages. I keep all these quotes in a database using a program called Devon Think, where I also store my own writing, chapters, essays, blog posts, notes. By combining my own words with passages from other sources, the collection becomes something more than just a file storage system. It becomes a digital extension of my imperfect memory, an archive of all my old ideas and the ideas that have influenced me. There are now more than 5,000 distinct entries in that database, and more than 3 million words, 60 books worth of quotes, fragments, and hunches, all individually captured by me, stored in a single database. Having all that information available at my fingertips is not just a quantitative matter of finding my notes faster. Yes, when I'm trying to track down an article I wrote many years ago, it's now much easier to retrieve. But the qualitative change lies elsewhere, in finding documents that I've forgotten about altogether, finding documents that I didn't know I was looking for. What makes the system truly powerful is the way that it fosters private serendipity. DEVONthink features a clever algorithm that detects subtle semantic connections between distinct passages of text. These tools are smart enough to get around the classic search engine failing of excessive specificity, searching for dog and missing all the articles that only have the word canine in them. Modern indexing software like DEVOnthinks learns associations between individual words by tracking the frequency with which words appear near each other. This can create almost lyrical connections between ideas. Several years ago, I was working on a book about cholera in London and queried DEVOnthinks for information about Victorian sewage systems. Because the software had detected that the word waste is often used alongside sewage, it directed me to a quote that explained the way bones evolved in vertebrate bodies, namely, by repurposing the calcium waste products created by the metabolism of cells. At first glance, that might seem like an errant result, but it sent me off on a long and fruitful tangent into the way complex systems, whether cities or bodies, find productive uses for the waste they create. That idea became a central organizing theme for one of the chapters in the cholera book. Now, strictly speaking, who was responsible for that initial idea? Was it me or the software? It sounds like a facetious question, but I mean it seriously. Obviously, the computer wasn't conscious of the idea taking shape, and I supplied the conceptual glue that linked the London sewers to cell metabolism. But I'm not at all confident that I would have made the initial connection without the help of the software. The idea was a true collaboration, two very different kinds of intelligence playing off one another, one carbon-based, the other silicon. When I'd first captured that quote about calcium in bone structure, I'd had no idea that it would ultimately connect to the history of London's sewage system. But there was something about that concept that intrigued me enough to store it in the database. It lingered there for years in the software's primordial soup, a slow hunch waiting for its connection. I use DEVOnthinks as an improvisational tool as well. I write a paragraph about something. Let's say it's about the human brain's remarkable facility for interpreting facial expressions. I then plugged that paragraph into the software and asked DEVOnthinks to find other passages in my archive that are similar. Instantly, a list of quotes appears on my screen, some delving into the neural architecture that triggers facial expressions, others exploring the evolutionary history of the smile, others dealing with the expressiveness of our near relatives, the chimpanzees. Invariably, one or two of these triggers a new association in my head. Perhaps I've forgotten about the chimpanzee connection, and so I select that quote and ask the software to find a new batch of passages similar to it. Before long, a larger idea takes shape in my head, built upon the trail of associations the machine has assembled for me. Compare that to the traditional way of exploring your files, where the computer is like a dutiful but dumb butler. Find me that document about the chimpanzees. That's searching. The other feels radically different, so different that we don't quite have a verb for it. It's riffing or exploring. There are false starts and red herrings, but there are just as many happy accidents and unexpected discoveries. Indeed, the fuzziness of the results is part of what makes the software so powerful. The serendipity of the system emerges out of two distinct forces. First, there is the connective power of the semantic algorithm, which is smart but also slightly unpredictable, thus creating a small amount of randomizing noise that makes the results more surprising. But that randomizing force is held in check by the fact that I have curated all these passages myself, which makes each individual connection far more likely to be useful to me in some way. When you start a new query in DEVOnthinks and look down at the initial results, at first glance they can sometimes seem jumbled and disconnected. But then you read through them in more detail, and inevitably something tantalizing catches your eye. Jumbled and disconnected is of course also how we describe the strange explorations of our dreams, and the comparison is an apt one. DEVOnthinks takes the strange but generative combinations of the dream state and turns them into software. If you visit the serendipity entry in Wikipedia, you are one click away from entries on LSD, Teflon, Parkinson's disease, Sri Lanka, Isaac Newton, Viagra, and about 200 other topics of comparable diversity. That eclecticism is particularly acute at Wikipedia, of course, but it derives from the fundamentally tangled nature of Tim Berners-Lee's original hypertext architecture. No medium in history has ever offered such unlikely trails of connection and chance in such an intuitive and accessible form. Yet in recent years, a puzzling meme has emerged on Opus Ed pages with a strange insistence: the rise of the web, its proponents argue, has led to a decline in serendipitous discovery. Consider this representative elegy to the endangered joy of serendipity, authored by a journalism professor named William McKean. Think about the library. Do people browse anymore? We have become such a directed people. We can target what we want thanks to the internet. Put a couple of keywords into a search engine and you find, with an irritating hit or miss here and there, exactly what you're looking for. It's efficient but dull. You miss the time-consuming but enriching act of looking through shelves, of pulling down a book because the title interests you, or the binding, looking for something and being surprised by what you find, even if it's not what you set out looking for, is one of life's great pleasures, and so far no software exists that can duplicate that experience. In a similar piece, the New York Times technology editor, Damon Darlin, complained that the digital age is stamping out serendipity. Darlin acknowledged the vast influx of suggested reading that now arrives on our screen every morning via social network services like Twitter and Facebook, but claimed those links didn't constitute serendipity. Really groupthink, Darlin argued. Everything we need to know comes filtered and vetted. We are discovering what everyone else is learning, and usually from people we have selected because they share our tastes. When critics complain about the decline of serendipity, they habitually point to two old media mechanisms that allegedly have no direct equivalent on the web. McKean mentions the first one, browsing the stacks in a library, pulling down a book because the title interests you, or the binding. Old-style browsing does indeed lead to unplanned discoveries. But thanks to the connective nature of hypertext, and the blogosphere's exploratory hunger for finding new stuff, it is far easier to sit down in front of your browser and stumble across something completely brilliant but surprising than it is to walk through a library, looking at the spines of books. Does everyone use the web this way? Of course not. But it is much more of a mainstream pursuit than randomly exploring the library stacks, pulling down books because you like the binding, ever was. This is the irony of the serendipity debate. The thing that is being mourned has actually gone from a fringe experience to the mainstream of the culture. The second analog-era mechanism that encourages serendipity involves the physical limitations of the print newspaper, which forces you to pass by a collection of artfully curated stories on a variety of topics before you open up the section that most closely matches your existing passions and knowledge. The legal scholar Cass Sunstein refers to this as an example of the architecture of serendipity. On the way to the sports section or the comics or the business page, you happen to collide with a story about the abuses of African diamond mines, and something in the headline catches your eye. 1,000 words later, you've learned something powerful about people living halfway around the world whose existence you had never contemplated before. And perhaps there is some kind of serendipitous click in that collision. You'd been looking for a new charitable cause to support, or contemplating buying your spouse a diamond ring. And then this story drops in your lap and helps you complete the thought. You weren't looking for a story about diamond mines, but it was exactly what you needed. This is indeed a superb example of serendipity, and there is no doubt that newspapers facilitated comparable accidental discoveries countless times over countless breakfast tables during their heyday. The question is whether the transition to the web makes this sort of discovery more or less frequent. If you compare the front pages of the print and online versions of a newspaper, the web actually appears to have the upper hand. The internet scholar Ethan Zuckerman compared the front page of the New York Times with that of its web cousin, found that the print version had 23 references on its front page to articles in the paper. The front page at nytimes.com, in Zuckerman's study, contained 315 links to articles and other forms of content. If the architecture of serendipity lies in stumbling across surprising connections while scanning the front page, then the web is more than 10 times as serendipitous as the classic print newspaper. Sunstein would no doubt argue that many people bypass the front door of their online newspaper, going directly to the sports or business section page that they've bookmarked, or to some other filter tailor-made to their pre-existing interests. No doubt millions of people use comparable filters every morning. One could reasonably question whether people like this who have gone out of their way to avoid encountering the big picture of the newspaper front page were ever likely to stumble across the diamond mining story at the breakfast table with a print paper, or ramble through the stacks of their local library. But Sunstein and Darlin and McKean are indeed correct when they argue that the internet gives us topical filters that were unheard of in the days of mass media. But those filters are only part of the story. Filters reduce serendipity. But beyond bookmarking, filters are a second-generation addition to the architecture of the web. They are not native to it. What is native to the web's architecture are two key features that have been great supporters of serendipity: a global, distributed medium in which anyone can be a publisher, and a hypertext document structure in which it is trivial to jump from a newspaper article to an academic essay to an encyclopedia entry in a matter of seconds. The information diversity of the web ensures that there is an endless supply of surprising information to stumble across, And the links of hypertext ensure that we can get to that information at lightning speed or follow trails of improvised association that would have been painfully slow to follow in the age of print media. Ironically, the problem with the web is that there's too much noise, too much chaos. That's why the filters were invented in the first place. We have filters because the web has unleashed too much diversity and surprise, not because we have too little. I happen to believe that the web, as a medium, has pushed the culture toward more serendipitous encounters. The simple fact that information browsing and surfing are now mainstream pursuits makes a strong case for a rise in serendipity, compared to cultures dominated by books or mass media. But whether or not you accept the premise that the average media consumer experiences more serendipitous discoveries thanks to the web, there can be little doubt that the web is an unrivaled medium for serendipity if you are actively seeking it out. If you want to build a daily reading list of eclectic and diverse perspectives, you can stitch one together in your RSS reader or your bookmarks bar in a matter of minutes, for no cost, while sitting on your couch. Just as important, you can use the web to fill out the context when you do stumble across some interesting new topic. The great oracle of the digital age, Google, is often invoked as a serendipity killer, because search queries function as a kind of on-demand filter that eliminates the 99.999% of the web that is not relevant to the searcher's current interest. But when critics put Google on the side of filters, they assume that most queries are variations on the theme, "I'm passionately interested in X and would like to learn more about it." No doubt some unthinkably large number of Google users enter queries that take that basic shape every day. But there's another type of query that is just as valuable. "Someone just told me about X and I know nothing about it, but it sounds interesting. Tell me more." This is the subtle way in which Google supports the serendipitous aspects of the web. Yes, it's true that by the time you've entered something into the Google search box, you're already invested in the topic. But often that investment is directly correlated with your ignorance about the topic at hand. Someone mentions in passing the poetry of John Ashbery, or the television show Arrested Development, or the tales swallowing our Ouroboros, and you think, what's the deal with that? It sounds really interesting. Imagine it's 1980 and you're sitting at your breakfast table, reading the morning paper, and on the way to the sports page you stumble across an article on the front page about this provocative new idea of global warming that you've not yet encountered. You can read the article, to be sure, but when the article leaves you hankering for more information and context, where do you go? Turn on the television and hope that one of the 3 networks or PBS is running a news item or a documentary on the topic at that exact second. Get in the car, drive 15 minutes down to your public library and check out a book on the subject. Go through all the magazines in your house, scouring their table of contents pages for any climate change-related articles. Let's say you live in a particularly information-rich household for the standards of 1980, and you happen to have a copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica. But of course the version you bought is actually the 1976 edition. And global warming doesn't make it into the Britannica until 1994, despite the fact that the term is common enough to be mentioned in ordinary parlance throughout the 90s. Today, of course, you would query either Google or Wikipedia for the search term global warming, and you would instantly have more information at your fingertips than would have been imaginable when you were thumbing through the Britannica in 1980. Yes, these results are targeted to your expressed interest in a specific topic, but that interest is often something you've just stumbled across, a hint more than a passion. And because those pages are built out of hyperlinks, just a few clicks can land you in an entirely new region of interest that you'd never dreamed of visiting. Google and Wikipedia give those passing hints something to attach to, a kind of information anchor that lets you settle down around a topic and explore the surrounding area. They turn hints and happy accidents into information. If the commonplace book tradition tells us that the best way to nurture hunches is to write everything down, the serendipity engine of the web suggests a parallel directive: look everything up. The premise that innovation prospers when ideas can serendipitously connect and recombine with other ideas, when hunches can stumble across other hunches that successfully fill in their blanks, may seem like an obvious truth. But the strange fact is that a great deal of the past 2 centuries of legal and folk wisdom about innovation has pursued the exact opposite argument: building walls between ideas, keeping them from the kind of random, serendipitous connections that exist in dreams and in the organic compounds of life. Ironically, those walls have been erected with the explicit aim of encouraging innovation. They go by many names: patents, digital rights management, intellectual property, trade secrets, proprietary technology. But they share a founding assumption: that in the long run, innovation will increase if you put restrictions on the spread of new ideas, because those restrictions will allow the creators to collect large financial rewards from their inventions. and those rewards will then attract other innovators to follow in their path. The problem with these closed environments is that they inhibit serendipity and reduce the overall network of minds that can potentially engage with a problem. This is why a growing number of large organizations, businesses, nonprofits, schools, government agencies have begun experimenting with work environments that encourage the architecture of serendipity. Traditionally, organizations that have a strong demand for innovation have created a kind of closed playpen for hunches, the research and development lab. Ironically, R&D labs have historically functioned as a kind of idea lockbox. The hunches evolving in those labs tended to be the most heavily guarded secrets in the entire organization. Allowing these early product ideas to circulate more widely would allow rival firms to copy or exploit them. Some organizations, including Apple, have gone to great lengths to keep R&D experiments sequestered from other employees inside the organization. But that secrecy, as we have seen, comes with great cost. Protecting ideas from copycats and competitors also protects them from other ideas that might improve them, might transform them from hints and hunches to true innovations. And indeed, there is a growing movement in some forward-thinking companies to turn their R&D labs inside out and make them far more transparent than the traditional model. Organizations like IBM and Procter & Gamble, who have a long history of profiting from patented, closed-door innovations, have embraced open innovation platforms over the past decade, sharing their leading-edge research with universities, partners, suppliers, and customers. In early 2010, Nike announced a new web-based marketplace it called the Green Exchange, where it publicly released more than 400 of its patents that involve environmentally friendly materials or technologies. The marketplace was a kind of hybrid of commercial self-interest and civic good. By making its good ideas public, Nike made it possible for outside firms to improve on those innovations, creating new value that Nike itself might ultimately be able to put to use in its own products. In a sense, Nike was widening the network of minds who were actively thinking about how to make its ideas more useful, without putting anyone else on its payroll. But Nike's organizational values also include a commitment to environmental sustainability, and the company recognized that many of its eco-friendly patents might be useful in different contexts. Nike is a big corporation, with many products in many categories, but there are limits to its reach. Some of its innovations might well turn out to be advantageous to industries or markets where it has no competitive involvement whatsoever. By keeping its eco-friendly ideas behind a veil of secrecy, Nike was holding back, without any real commercial justification, ideas that might, in another context, contribute to a sustainable future. In collaboration with Creative Commons, Nike released its patents under a modified license permitting use in non-competitive fields. The example scenario they invoked at the launch of Green Exchange would have warmed the heart of Stephen Jay Gould, an environmentally sound rubber originally invented for use in running shoes that could be adapted by a mountain bike company to create more sustainable tires. Apparently, Good's tires to sandals principle works both ways. Sometimes you make footwear by putting tires to new use, sometimes you make tires by putting footwear to new use. Green Exchange is trying to give multinational corporations some of the same freedom to reinvent and recycle that good sandal makers enjoy sifting through the Nairobi junkyards. The other organizational technique for facilitating serendipitous connections is the brainstorm session, an approach pioneered by the advertising executive Alex Osborne in the 1930s. Brainstorming opens up the flow of ideas and hunches in a more generative fashion than is customary in a regimented workplace meeting. Yet a number of recent studies have suggested that brainstorming is less effective than its practitioners would like. One trouble with brainstorming is that it is finite in both time and space. A group gathers for an hour in a room, or for a day-long corporate retreat, they toss out a bunch of crazy ideas, and then the meeting disperses. Sometimes a useful connection emerges, but too often the relevant hunches aren't in sync with one another. One employee has a promising hunch in one office, and 2 months later, another employee comes up with the missing piece that turns that hunch into a genuine insight. Brainstorming might bring those two fragments together, but the odds are against it. Imagine some kind of alternate reality where the FBI holds a corporate retreat in late August of 2001 and invites the field agents from Arizona and Minnesota to sit in a room together and brainstorm new potential threats against the United States. No doubt it would have been the first corporate retreat on record that actually changed the fate of world history. But with more than 10,000 field agents across the nation, the odds against getting the right people from Arizona and Minnesota together at the right time would have been astronomical. But imagine if the FBI had been using a networked version of a Devon Think archive instead of the archaic automated case support system. The top brass at the radical fundamentalist unit would still have read the search warrant request for Mouse AIUI's laptop and thought to themselves, This sounds like a pretty shaky hunch. But a quick Devon Think query would have pointed them to the Phoenix memo, to another hunch about flight training and terrorism. Those two unlikely ideas would have collided, without the field agents in Phoenix and Minnesota even speaking to each other, much less sitting down for a brainstorming session. The secret to organizational inspiration is to build information networks that allow hunches to persist and disperse and recombine. Instead of cloistering your hunches in brainstorm sessions or R&D labs, create an environment where brainstorming is something that is constantly running in the background, throughout the organization, a collective version of the 20% time concept that proved so successful for Google and 3M. One way to do this is to create an open database of hunches, the Web 2.0 version of the traditional suggestion box. A public hunch database makes every passing idea visible to everyone else in the organization, not just management. Other employees can comment or expand on those ideas, connecting them with their own hunches about new products or priorities or internal organizational changes. Some systems even allow employees to vote on their colleagues' suggestions, not unlike the user rankings that power collective news sites like Dig or Reddit. Google has a company-wide email list where employees can suggest new features or products. Each suggestion can then be rated on a scale of 0 to 5. Great idea. Make it so. Salesforce.com maintains a popular idea exchange where its customers can suggest new features for the company's software product. The idea exchange doesn't just allow interesting hunches to circulate and connect. It also tracks their maturation into shipping code. The front door of the exchange includes prominent links to submitted ideas currently being considered for inclusion in future releases, as well as ideas that were successfully integrated into past releases. Too often, real-world suggestion boxes feel like a black hole. You drop your idea in the slot and never hear about it again. In a public forum like Idea Exchange, not only do you get to see and improve other people's suggestions, but you get tangible evidence that your ideas can make a difference. These kinds of information networks can do a masterful job of tapping both individual and collective intelligence. The individual employee has a provocative and useful hunch, and the group helps complete the hunch by connecting it to other ideas that have circulated through the system, and helps separate out that hunch from the thousands of other less useful ones by voting it to the top of the charts. By making the ideas public, and by ensuring that they remain stored in the database, these systems create an architecture for organizational serendipity. They give good ideas new ways to connect.